Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax.
The alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of Alex Morgan's small cabin outside West Glacier. He silenced it with practiced efficiency, already fully awake. 6 years as a park ranger had conditioned him to snap from deep sleep to complete alertness in seconds. Even now, 2 years after leaving the service, the habit persisted. Alex swung his legs out of bed, bare feet finding the cold hardwood floor. October in Montana meant the first real bite of winter was already in the air. Through his bedroom window, he could see the faint outline of mountains against the star-heavy sky, their peaks dusted with fresh snow that had fallen overnight. The coffee maker gurgled to life as he moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision. Shower, shave, dress in layers, thermal underwear, wool shirt, fleece jacket. His movements were economical, purposeful. Every action served the day ahead. The call had come at 11:47 p.m. the previous night. Sarah Chen, wildlife photographer, 28 years old, overdue from a solo shoot in the Bowman Lake area. Her rental car found in the parking area, her planned return time passed by 6 hours. Park Service was organizing a search and rescue operation at first light. They'd called Alex because he knew the terrain better than anyone. Bowman Lake sat in a remote corner of Glacier National Park, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that twisted through dense forest for 6 miles. It was the kind of place where even experienced outdoors people could get into trouble quickly. Alex filled his thermos with black coffee and methodically packed his gear. First aid kit, emergency shelter, extra food, water purification tablets, headlamp, spare batteries. His old Ranger pack still held everything in its designated pockets, muscle memory guiding his hands in the darkness. The GPS unit went into his jacket pocket, though he rarely needed it. His internal compass had never failed him, even in complete whiteout conditions. It was one of several abilities that had made him exceptional at his job, abilities he'd never fully understood, but had learned to trust completely. By 6:15 a.m., Alex was driving his Toyota Tacoma through the park's entrance gate, headlights cutting through the early morning gloom. The overnight snowfall had been light but persistent, laying a thin, white blanket over everything. Beautiful under normal circumstances, potentially deadly for someone caught unprepared. The drive to Bowman Lake took 45 minutes on the winding dirt road. Alex knew every turn, every landmark, every place where the road narrowed or where rockfall posed a hazard. He'd patrolled this area hundreds of times during his ranger years, responding to everything from minor injuries to body recoveries. The parking area held 3 vehicles: Sarah Chen's rental sedan, a Park Service truck, and a Jeep Cherokee that Alex recognized as belonging to Mike Hendricks, the current lead ranger for this sector. Mike stood near his truck, steam rising from a coffee cup in his hands, speaking into a radio. Alex parked and approached, his boots crunching on the thin snow. "Morning, Mike. What do we know?" Mike looked up, relief evident on his weathered face. "Alex, thank God. We've got a real puzzle here." He gestured toward the sedan. "Car's been here since yesterday afternoon based on the snow accumulation. Her gear's all accounted for. Camera bag, tripod, all the expensive stuff, but no sign of where she went. You check the obvious trails? First thing, nothing. No footprints, no disturbed snow, nothing. It's like she just vanished." Mike's frustration was clear. "That's why I called you. You always could see things the rest of us missed." Alex nodded, already shifting into what his former colleagues called tracker mode. His vision seemed to sharpen, his awareness expanding to take in every detail of the surrounding area. It wasn't mystical or supernatural, just a learned ability to process visual information in ways that most people couldn't. He walked slowly around Sarah's car, examining the ground. The overnight snowfall had been steady enough to cover most tracks, but not everything. Near the driver's side door, partially protected by the car's overhang, he found what he was looking for. "Here," he called Mike over. Partial footprint, women's hiking boot, size 7 or 8, heading toward the lake trail. Mike squinted at the barely visible depression in the snow. "I looked there. Didn't see anything." Alex was already moving, following a trail invisible to everyone else. Boot prints, subtle disturbances in the vegetation, tiny torn fragments of fabric on thorny bushes. Sarah Chen had indeed taken the lake trail, but she'd moved carefully, like someone who understood wilderness travel. The trail wound through dense forest for the first half-mile before opening up along the shoreline of Bowman Lake. Alex moved at a steady pace, reading the landscape like text on a page. Everything told a story. The way snow had accumulated differently in various spots. The behavior of small animals whose tracks crisscrossed the path. The subtle changes in vegetation that indicated different microclimates and soil conditions. 20 minutes into the search, Alex stopped abruptly. Something was wrong. The forest around him had gone unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no small animals rustling through the underbrush. Even the wind seemed muted. In his years of wilderness experience, this kind of silence meant one of two things. Either a large predator was nearby, or something else had disturbed the natural order. Alex activated his radio. "Mike, you copy?" Static answered him. He checked the unit, full battery, proper channel. The radio should be working perfectly. He continued along the trail, his senses now heightened to maximum alertness. Every shadow seemed potentially significant, every sound amplified. The thin snow beneath his feet crunched with each step, impossibly loud in the unnatural quiet. At a bend in the trail, Alex found the first real clue. A camera lens cap, partially buried in snow near a large boulder. He examined it without touching, noting its position, the way snow had accumulated around it. It had been dropped, not thrown. Recently, within the last 12 hours. But something about its placement bothered him. The cap lay in an open area where any photographer would have noticed dropping it immediately. Sarah Chen was a professional. She wouldn't have walked away without retrieving such an essential piece of equipment, unless she hadn't been able to. Alex studied the surrounding area more carefully. The boulder was roughly 8 feet tall and 12 feet long, a massive granite outcrop that had tumbled from the mountainside centuries ago. It created a natural blind spot, blocking views both up and down the trail. Behind the boulder, protected from the overnight snowfall, Alex found what made his blood chill. Boot prints. Men's size 11, deep tread pattern consistent with tactical or military-style footwear. The prints showed deliberate placement, someone who had positioned themselves behind the rock and waited. The depth and spacing of the impressions suggested someone large and patient, someone who knew how to remain motionless for extended periods. But it was the other details that activated every alarm in Alex's experienced mind. The prints showed signs of systematic observation. Toe impressions, indicating someone who had shifted position multiple times to maintain visual contact with the trail. This wasn't random. Someone had deliberately chosen this location as an ambush point. Alex followed the tactical boot prints away from the boulder. The trail led into dense forest, moving parallel to the main hiking path but staying approximately 50 yards away from it. Whoever had made these tracks possessed advanced fieldcraft skills. They'd chosen routes that minimized ground disturbance and avoided areas where tracks would be easily visible. After a quarter mile, the boot prints converged with Sarah's trail. The scene told a clear story. She had been approached, probably surprised, and then both sets of tracks continued together into the wilderness. But the pattern of the combined trail suggested coercion rather than cooperation. Sarah's footprints showed signs of hesitation, irregular spacing, the kind of gait that indicated fear or reluctance. Alex tried his radio again. Still nothing but static. He reached for his cell phone, though he knew coverage was minimal in this area. No signal as expected. The nearest reliable communication would be back at the parking area, a 40-minute hike. Every instinct told him to return immediately, to get help, to approach this situation with backup and proper equipment. But those same instincts also told him that Sarah Chen might not have 40 minutes plus the time it would take to organize a proper search team. Alex pressed forward, following the combined trail deeper into the wilderness. The tracks led away from all established hiking routes into terrain that most visitors never saw. This was backcountry wilderness, the kind of landscape that could swallow people without a trace. Alex's familiarity with the area was crucial now. Without his natural navigation abilities and years of experience, the trail would have been impossible to follow. The forest grew denser as elevation increased. Thick stands of Douglas fir and lodgepole pine blocked most sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. Snow fell more heavily here, and Alex realized that within hours, any tracks would be completely obscured. After another mile, the trail stopped at what appeared to be a sheer rock face. Alex examined the area carefully, knowing that nothing in wilderness travel was ever as simple as it appeared. Rock faces had cracks and hidden passages, dense vegetation often concealed alternate routes. He found it after 10 minutes of systematic searching, a narrow gap between two large boulders, barely wide enough for a single person. The opening was partially concealed by overhanging branches, invisible unless viewed from exactly the right angle. Boot prints led directly into the gap. Alex squeezed through the opening and emerged into a small, natural amphitheater, completely hidden from the surrounding forest. High rock walls on 3 sides created perfect acoustic isolation. Sounds made here would never carry to the outside world. In the center of the space stood a makeshift shelter constructed with professional-level expertise. Camouflaged tarp, minimal profile, positioned to be invisible from above. Whoever built this understood advanced survival techniques and had taken considerable time to prepare the location. Near the shelter, Alex found Sarah's camera equipment neatly arranged on a flat rock. Expensive lenses, multiple camera bodies, thousands of dollars worth of professional gear. It hadn't been damaged or carelessly discarded. Someone had deliberately preserved it. But Sarah herself was nowhere to be seen. Alex approached the shelter cautiously, every sense alert for potential threats. The structure showed signs of recent occupation, still warm ashes from a small fire, food containers, a sleeping bag that retained body heat. And then, he found the notebook. It lay open on a flat rock near the shelter, pages weighted down with small stones. The handwriting was precise, methodical, like a field researcher documenting observations. But the content made Alex's stomach clench. Day 1, subject acquired successfully. Initial assessment confirms preliminary research. Physical condition excellent. Psychological profile suggests high resilience threshold. Beginning baseline behavioral documentation. Day 2, subject adaptation rate exceeds projections. Implementing stress escalation protocol. Fascinating to observe decision-making processes under controlled duress. Alex flipped through more pages, his horror mounting with each entry. This wasn't random violence or simple abduction. Someone was conducting elaborate psychological experiments, using human beings as test subjects in carefully controlled scenarios. The final entry was dated that morning. Day 3, unexpected variable introduced. Park Service responding faster than anticipated. Subject appears to maintain hope of rescue, affecting behavioral compliance. May need to accelerate timeline or introduce additional stressor. Note: unusual tracking capabilities detected in lead searcher. Alex Morgan, former park ranger, exceptional wilderness skills documented in personnel files. Recommend immediate evaluation as potential secondary subject. Alex felt ice crystallize in his veins. Whoever had taken Sarah knew his name, had researched his background, had been watching him track through the wilderness. The radio silence, the perfectly positioned ambush site, the hidden shelter. None of it was random. He'd been led here deliberately. A branch snapped somewhere behind him. Alex spun around, his hand moving instinctively to the knife on his belt. The small amphitheater remained empty, but his enhanced environmental awareness, that sixth sense developed through years of wilderness work, screamed warnings. He was being watched, evaluated, studied. "I know you're there," Alex called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I know you've been tracking me since I left the parking area." Silence stretched for long seconds. Then a voice answered from the rocks above, calm and conversational. "Impressive, Mr. Morgan. Most people would never have found this location, much less recognize they were being observed. Your reputation appears to be well-deserved." Alex looked up, but couldn't pinpoint the voice's exact source. The speaker was using the amphitheater's acoustics to mask his position, another sign of sophisticated tactical knowledge. "Where is Sarah Chen?" "Safe, for the moment. Undergoing evaluation in a controlled environment." The voice carried no emotion, like a researcher discussing laboratory conditions. "Her cooperation has been exemplary so far." "What do you want?" "To understand human adaptability under extreme stress. To document decision-making processes when survival instincts override social conditioning. To observe what people truly become when civilization's constraints are removed." Alex heard movement in the rocks but still couldn't locate the source. Whoever this was possessed exceptional fieldcraft abilities, possibly military training. "You're talking about torture. I'm talking about revelation. Most humans live their entire lives without ever discovering what they're truly capable of. I provide them with that opportunity. By terrorizing innocent people. By removing the comfortable illusions that prevent authentic self-knowledge." The voice shifted position, definitely moving between different locations to avoid detection. "Tell me, Mr. Morgan, what did you discover about yourself during those long nights alone on patrol? When you were miles from help, responsible for other people's safety, forced to rely entirely on your own capabilities." Alex realized with growing unease that his pursuer had studied his background thoroughly. The question hit closer to home than he wanted to admit. "I discovered that some people deserve protection from predators like you." "And how do you plan to provide that protection? You're alone, miles from help, tracking an opponent who knows this terrain as well as you do. Your radio doesn't work. Your cell phone has no signal. No one knows where you are." The voice paused, and Alex could hear the speaker moving again, repositioning for better tactical advantage. "But you came anyway, didn't you? Despite recognizing the risks, despite knowing this could be a trap, you followed the trail because someone needed help. That's fascinating behavioral data, Mr. Morgan. Most people would have retreated to get reinforcements." Alex felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. This person understood psychology with the precision of a predator who'd studied his prey extensively. "Where is Sarah?" he repeated. 2 miles east, in another location similar to this one. Alive and unharmed, though somewhat concerned about her situation. Whether she remains in that condition depends largely on your choices over the next few hours." "What choices?" "You can attempt to return to the parking area and organize a conventional search and rescue operation. By the time you arrive with help, Ms. Chen and I will be long gone, relocated to one of several alternate sites I've prepared throughout this wilderness area." Alex heard the unspoken threat. Sarah would disappear permanently if he left to get help, or you can continue forward, engage with the situation directly, and discover what you're truly capable of when everything depends on your individual skills. The speaker's tone carried unmistakable anticipation, like a researcher excited about a particularly interesting experiment. "You want me to come after you? I want to see what happens when two highly skilled individuals meet under authentic survival conditions. No backup, no equipment advantages, no external support systems. Just human capability against human capability." Alex realized he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than a simple killer. This person possessed advanced psychological training, sophisticated planning abilities, and a completely detached view of human life. Military intelligence background, possibly special operations, definitely someone who'd studied human behavior under extreme conditions. "You mentioned personnel files," Alex said, buying time while he scanned the amphitheater for potential escape routes or tactical advantages. "How did you access those?" "Background research is essential for any serious study. I know about your service record, your exceptional tracking abilities, your uncanny navigation skills. I know you've never lost a lost hiker, never failed to recover someone in distress." The voice carried an edge of genuine respect, which somehow made it more disturbing. "I also know about the incident in your final year of service, the search for the missing geologists during that blizzard. How you found them when everyone else had given up. How you navigated through complete whiteout conditions using nothing but intuition and experience." Alex's jaw clenched. That rescue had been the highlight of his ranger career, saving 3 lives under impossible conditions. The fact that his pursuer knew about it in detail meant extensive research, possibly inside access to park service records. "What incident are you referring to specifically?" Alex asked, testing how much the speaker actually knew. "February 12th, 3 years ago. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Dr. Marcus Kim, and graduate student Tony Rodriguez from University of Montana Geology Department. Caught in sudden blizzard conditions while conducting research on glacial sediment patterns." The level of detail chilled Alex more than the mountain air. This person had studied not just his professional record, but specific incidents that had never been widely publicized. "Search and rescue teams had been looking for 18 hours when you arrived," the voice continued. "Visibility near zero, temperature dropping to -20, winds gusting over 40 miles per hour. Every other searcher had been recalled due to dangerous conditions." Alex remembered that night with crystalline clarity. The worst weather he'd ever worked in, the kind of conditions that killed experienced outdoorsmen within hours. "But you kept going," the speaker said, "alone, using some combination of skills that no one else possessed. You found them in a location that defied all logical search patterns, nearly 6 miles from their last known position. They followed a drainage looking for shelter," Alex said automatically. "Basic survival behavior, except the drainage you found them in wasn't visible on any topographic map. It was a seasonal runoff channel, completely hidden under normal conditions. How did you know to look there?" Alex had never been able to fully explain that decision, even to himself. Something about the terrain, the wind patterns, the way snow had accumulated in certain areas, it had created an internal map in his mind, showing him where desperate people might seek shelter. "Experience," he said. "Or something more than experience, something that goes beyond normal human sensory capabilities." Alex felt increasingly like a specimen under examination. This person was probing not just his background, but his most fundamental abilities, the instinctive skills that he'd never fully understood himself. "The geologist described it as miraculous," the voice continued. "Dr. Walsh said you appeared out of the storm, like you'd been guided there by supernatural forces. But it wasn't supernatural, was it, Mr. Morgan? It was something else entirely. What's your point?" "My point is that you represent a fascinating example of human adaptation. Urban civilization has dulled most people's natural capabilities, but some individuals retain primitive skills that border on the extraordinary. You navigate by internal compass. You track by reading signs others can't see. You sense human presence through mechanisms that conventional psychology can't explain. Alex realized his pursuer was building towards something, laying psychological groundwork for whatever confrontation lay ahead. I survived 18 months alone in hostile territory, Mr. Morgan. 18 months of discovering what humans become when everything civilized is stripped away. I learned that most people are weak, dependent, incapable of authentic survival. But occasionally, very occasionally, you encounter someone different. Someone who retained the old skills. The voice carried a note of genuine excitement now, like a scientist discussing a rare and valuable specimen. That's what you are. That's why this encounter is so valuable. I want to document what happens when two individuals with authentic survival capabilities meet under primal conditions. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about discovery, about pushing human potential to its absolute limits and observing the results. Alex heard movement again, closer this time. His environmental awareness told him the speaker was repositioning for direct contact, done with long-distance conversation. Ms. Chen is 2 miles east, as I mentioned. The route is challenging but not impossible for someone with your skills. However, reaching her location will require passing through several areas where I'll have tactical advantages. You want me to hunt you? I want to see if you're capable of it. Most park rangers are essentially tour guides with first aid training, but you're different. Your service record suggests someone who understands genuine fieldcraft. Alex spotted movement in the rocks above, a brief shadow that confirmed his suspicion about the speaker's location. Military-style concealment, professional-level positioning. What happens if I reach Sarah? That depends on how effectively you adapt to the challenges between here and there. This is authentic survival, Mr. Morgan, the kind of situation that reveals what people truly are beneath their social conditioning. The voice was now coming from a different location, confirming that the speaker was mobile and maintaining tactical advantage. You have approximately 4 hours of daylight remaining. The route to Ms. Chen's location becomes significantly more dangerous after dark. Snow is forecast to increase throughout the afternoon. Alex understood the implicit time limit. Whatever was going to happen needed to happen soon. I'm going to ask you one more time, Alex said, his voice carrying the authority he'd developed through years of dealing with dangerous situations. Release Sarah Chen and walk away. This doesn't have to escalate. Laughter echoed off the rock walls, not maniacal or uncontrolled, but genuinely amused. Mr. Morgan, you've been tracking me for hours. You've found my concealed shelter, read my research notes, and engaged in direct conversation despite recognizing the extreme danger of your situation. Do you really think either of us is going to simply walk away? Alex realized with uncomfortable clarity that his pursuer was right. This had moved beyond simple rescue into something far more primal. Besides, the voice continued, you came here because someone needed help. That's who you are at the most fundamental level. You won't abandon Ms. Chen any more than you abandoned those geologists 3 years ago. A small object landed at Alex's feet. A digital camera memory card in a protective case. Photos of Ms. Chen's current situation, the voice explained. Proof that she's alive and motivation for you to continue forward. The camera is in my pack if you'd like to verify the images. Alex pocketed the memory card without looking at it. He didn't need additional motivation. The trail east begins at the far end of this amphitheater. Follow the rock cairns, small stacks of stones marking the route. But be aware that the path includes several challenges designed to test your capabilities. Booby traps, learning experiences, opportunities to demonstrate the skills that make you exceptional. Alex moved toward the amphitheater's eastern edge, every sense alert for potential threats. The hidden entrance he'd used to enter was behind him now, blocked by the speaker's position in the rocks above. One final piece of information, Mr. Morgan. My name is Thomas Reed. I was a captain in Army intelligence, specializing in survival training and psychological operations. I spent 18 months in the mountains of Afghanistan after my unit was eliminated, learning what humans become when civilization disappears. The voice carried a note of pride, mixed with something darker. That experience taught me that most people are living lies, dependent on systems and support structures that mask their fundamental weakness. But it also taught me that rare individuals possess capabilities that transcend normal human limitations. Alex found the trail marker, 3 flat stones stacked precisely on a boulder at the amphitheater's eastern exit. You represent the most interesting subject I've encountered, Mr. Morgan, someone who retained primitive skills in spite of modern conditioning. I'm genuinely curious to see how far those abilities extend. And if I don't meet your expectations, then Ms. Chen dies, and I relocate to continue my research elsewhere. But I don't think that will happen. Your service record suggests someone who rises to challenges rather than backing down from them. Alex stepped onto the trail leading east, noting immediately that it had been carefully prepared. The route showed signs of deliberate construction, cleared obstacles, improved footing, strategic placement of natural handholds. Someone had invested significant time in creating a path that would channel movement in specific directions. The first challenge appears approximately half a mile ahead, Thomas called after him. I'll be observing your solution method with considerable interest. Alex moved forward, using all his wilderness skills to read the terrain ahead. The trail wound through dense forest before ascending toward a saddle between 2 peaks. Excellent ambush territory, multiple positions for concealment, limited escape routes, but also terrain that Alex knew intimately from his years of park service. Every ridge, every drainage, every stand of trees was mapped in his spatial memory with perfect clarity. If Thomas Reed wanted to test wilderness skills, he'd chosen an opponent who understood this landscape better than almost anyone alive. The first trap appeared exactly where Alex expected it, at a narrow point where the trail passed between 2 large boulders. A simple snare designed to catch an ankle connected to a counterweight that would suspend the victim upside down from a tree branch. Professional construction, military-level engineering, potentially lethal if triggered incorrectly. But Alex had encountered similar devices during his ranger training, and his enhanced spatial awareness showed him the trigger mechanism clearly. He disarmed the trap in under 2 minutes and continued forward. The second challenge was more sophisticated. A section of trail where the apparent path led across what looked like solid ground, but was actually a carefully concealed pit. Again, potentially deadly if approached carelessly. Alex's ability to read terrain saved him. The vegetation patterns, soil color variations, and subtle differences in snow accumulation all indicated disturbed ground. He found the safe route around the pit and marked his passage with small stones, both to help potential rescuers follow his trail and to demonstrate his capabilities to his observer. Impressive, Thomas's voice carried from somewhere nearby, though Alex couldn't pinpoint the location. Most people would have fallen into at least one of those traps. Most people don't have 6 years of wilderness training, Alex replied, continuing to move forward but maintaining constant alertness for additional threats. Training explains technique, but not the level of environmental awareness you've demonstrated. You're reading this landscape in ways that go beyond conventional education. Alex reached the trail's highest point, a narrow saddle between 2 peaks that offered views of the surrounding wilderness. From this vantage point, he could see the entire route he'd traveled and several possible paths forward. But more importantly, his enhanced environmental awareness told him exactly where Thomas was positioned, in a cluster of large rocks approximately 200 yards to the north, using high-powered optics to observe and evaluate every move. "You know where I am?" Thomas called out, confirming Alex's assessment. "That's remarkable spatial awareness, Mr. Morgan. How do you explain that capability?" Alex studied the terrain ahead, noting several more potential trap locations and planning his route accordingly. Some people are good with numbers, some people have perfect pitch, I read landscapes. It's more than that. You're processing environmental information through sensory mechanisms that most humans have lost. Primitive navigation skills, predator awareness, territorial consciousness. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Alex had never fully understood his own abilities, but Thomas's analysis came closer to explanation than anything he'd heard before. Ms. Chen's location is approximately 1 mile northeast of your current position, Thomas continued. The route includes 3 more challenges, each designed to test different aspects of your capabilities. Alex could see the general direction Thomas indicated, but the terrain was complex. Multiple ridges, dense forest, several potential routes that would require different skills to navigate successfully. "Why are you doing this?" Alex asked, genuine curiosity mixing with tactical assessment. Understanding an opponent's psychology often revealed weaknesses that could be exploited. Because 18 months alone in those mountains showed me something that most people never see. When everything civilized disappears, when survival depends entirely on individual capability, humans reveal their authentic nature. Thomas's voice carried an intensity that suggested deep, personal conviction. Most people are weak, dependent, incapable of genuine self-reliance. They've been conditioned by civilization to rely on external systems, other people, artificial support structures. When those disappear, they collapse immediately. Alex began moving northeast, following his internal navigation system while listening to Thomas's psychological revelation. But some individuals, very rare individuals, retain the old skills. The primitive capabilities that allowed humans to survive for thousands of years before civilization made them soft and dependent. So you test people by terrorizing them. I reveal what they truly are by removing the comfortable illusions that prevent authentic self-knowledge. Most fail immediately. They break down, panic, become helpless within hours. Alex encountered the third trap, a deadfall designed to crush anyone who triggered the mechanism. Sophisticated engineering, potentially fatal, but clearly visible to someone who understood how such devices were constructed. He disarmed it and continued forward. But occasionally, very occasionally, you find someone like Ms. Chen. She's lasted 3 days with minimal food, improvised shelter, constant psychological pressure. Her survival instincts are stronger than average. 3 days of torture. 3 days of discovering capabilities she never knew she possessed. By the time this is over, she'll understand herself in ways that most people never achieve. Alex crested a small ridge and saw his destination. Another hidden amphitheater, larger than the first, with a more elaborate shelter constructed in its center. Smoke rose from a small fire, and he could see a figure near the flames. Sarah Chen, alive but clearly exhausted and frightened. But between Alex and the amphitheater lay the most challenging terrain yet, a steep descent followed by a narrow approach with minimal cover, perfect killing ground for someone positioned on the surrounding heights. "The final test, Mr. Morgan," Thomas called from a new position. "Reaching Ms. Chen requires crossing open ground while I maintain overwatch with a hunting rifle, scope sighted, accurate to 600 yards, loaded with ammunition sufficient to prevent any rescue attempt." Alex studied the approach carefully, his tactical knowledge warring with his protective instincts. Sarah was maybe 300 yards away, but the route exposed him to sniper fire for most of the distance. "Here's what's going to happen," Thomas continued, his voice now carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling life and death situations. "You're going to attempt a rescue approach. I'm going to track you through the rifle scope, evaluating your tactical movement, your ability to use available cover, your decision-making under extreme pressure. And then you shoot me. That depends entirely on how well you perform. This is authentic testing, Mr. Morgan, real survival conditions with actual consequences. If you demonstrate exceptional capability, if you prove worthy of study, then both you and Ms. Chen survive this encounter. Alex felt the psychological manipulation in Thomas's words, but also recognized genuine conviction. This person believed completely in his twisted philosophy, saw himself as conducting legitimate research rather than committing murder. If you fail to meet expectations, then you become another data point in my ongoing study of human limitations under stress. Alex began his descent toward the amphitheater, using every piece of available cover while knowing that Thomas was tracking his movement through a rifle scope. Every boulder, every tree, every fold in the terrain became crucial to survival. But as he moved, Alex's enhanced environmental awareness provided information that Thomas couldn't account for. Wind direction, acoustic shadows, subtle changes in lighting that revealed sniper positions. The behavior of small animals that indicated human presence in specific locations. Alex could sense exactly where Thomas was positioned. In rocks on the amphitheater's western rim, approximately 400 yards away, elevated position with excellent fields of fire. But Thomas's position also had limitations. The angle of sightlines, areas of dead ground that couldn't be observed, approach routes that would be difficult to cover effectively. Alex reached the amphitheater floor and sprinted toward Sarah's location, using a zigzag pattern that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. He covered the final 100 yards in under 30 seconds, reaching the shelter area before Thomas could reposition for a clear shot. Sarah looked up as he approached, her face showing relief mixed with exhaustion and fear. "Thank God," she whispered. "I thought no one would find me." "Are you injured?" Alex asked, quickly examining her for obvious wounds while maintaining awareness of potential sniper positions. "No, just cold and hungry. He's been studying me, taking notes, asking questions, running psychological tests, like I'm some kind of laboratory experiment." Alex helped Sarah to her feet, noting that she was physically capable of movement despite 3 days of captivity. Thomas had been telling the truth about keeping her alive and relatively unharmed. "We need to move," Alex said. "He's got us in his sights from the western rim." But as they prepared to leave the shelter area, Thomas's voice echoed across the amphitheater, now carrying a note of genuine admiration. "Exceptional approach work, Mr. Morgan. You used terrain masking more effectively than most military personnel I've observed. Your tactical movement demonstrated advanced understanding of sniper limitations and countermeasures." Alex looked up toward the western rim, but couldn't see Thomas's exact position. Professional-level concealment as expected. However, your current situation presents an interesting tactical problem. Leaving this area requires crossing open ground while escorting a civilian who lacks your movement capabilities. Significantly more challenging than your solo approach. Thomas was right. Alex could probably escape the amphitheater using the same techniques that had gotten him there, but protecting Sarah during the movement would be exponentially more difficult. "I'm curious to see how you solve this problem," Thomas continued. "Most people would attempt immediate escape, exposing both themselves and the person they're trying to protect. But you have sufficient tactical knowledge to recognize the risks." Alex studied the available options, his mind racing through possible solutions. The amphitheater's geography limited escape routes, and Thomas's elevated position commanded most of the potential paths. But Alex's spatial memory provided an advantage that Thomas couldn't have anticipated. During his years of patrol work, Alex had explored every corner of this wilderness area, including terrain features that weren't marked on standard maps. "There's something else you should know, Mr. Morgan," Thomas called down. "This encounter has exceeded my expectations in ways I didn't anticipate. Your capabilities represent exactly the kind of human potential I've been documenting." Alex heard something different in Thomas's tone. Not just clinical observation, but genuine excitement. "Most of my subjects break within hours. They panic, make desperate mistakes, demonstrate exactly the weakness that modern civilization has bred into humanity. But you've responded to every challenge with competence that borders on the extraordinary." Sarah gripped Alex's arm. "He's been talking like this for days," she whispered, "like we're specimens in some kind of experiment." "You are specimens," Thomas called down, apparently having heard her comment, "and you're both demonstrating survival capabilities that justify continued study." Alex realized with growing unease that Thomas's psychology was shifting. Initial planning had probably involved eliminating both subjects after documentation, but Alex's performance had introduced an unexpected variable. "I'm prepared to offer you a proposition, Mr. Morgan," Thomas announced. "Join my research voluntarily. Help me document authentic human survival capabilities. Assist in identifying and testing other individuals who might possess similar potential." "You're asking me to become a serial killer." "I'm asking you to become a scientist, to help reveal human capabilities that civilization has hidden and suppressed." Alex felt Sarah shudder beside him. The proposition was insane, but Thomas presented it with complete sincerity. "Consider the alternative," Thomas continued. "Attempting escape under current conditions, even if successful, you'd spend the rest of your life knowing that someone with my capabilities remains free to continue this work with less skilled subjects." The implicit threat was clear. Thomas would disappear into the wilderness and continue his deadly experiments with victims who lacked Alex's survival skills. But Thomas had made his first tactical error: psychological overconfidence. His fascination with Alex's abilities had led him to reveal information that could be used against him. Alex now knew Thomas's location precisely, understood his psychological motivations, and recognized the flaws in his tactical position. Most importantly, Alex's spatial memory had identified an escape route that Thomas couldn't have anticipated: a concealed drainage that would allow movement to safety without exposure to sniper fire. "I need time to consider your offer," Alex called back, buying time while he prepared for movement. "Of course, such a decision shouldn't be made hastily," Alex quickly explained the escape plan to Sarah, using hand signals and whispered words to avoid revealing their intentions. The drainage was narrow and partially concealed by overhanging vegetation, invisible from Thomas's position, but accessible from their current location. "When I give the signal, we move together toward that cluster of rocks," Alex whispered, indicating a position that would mask their initial movement. "From there, we follow the drainage downstream. Stay low, move quietly, and trust my navigation." Sarah nodded, showing the kind of controlled courage that explained her survival during 3 days of captivity. "Your answer, Mr. Morgan?" Thomas called. "I'm still thinking," Alex replied while positioning himself for rapid movement. But Thomas's next words revealed that psychological manipulation was only part of his tactical approach. "Perhaps this will help clarify your decision," Thomas said, his voice now carrying cold authority. "I have explosive devices positioned at 3 locations along your most likely escape routes. Military-grade charges, command detonated, sufficient to eliminate both subjects regardless of your movement capabilities." Alex felt his tactical options collapse. Thomas had anticipated potential escape attempts and prepared countermeasures that eliminated conventional evasion strategies. But Thomas's revelation also confirmed something crucial. He was operating alone. Multiple explosive devices required careful preparation and positioning, something that would have been impossible with accomplices. Thomas was a single opponent, highly skilled, but ultimately limited by individual capabilities. Alex's enhanced environmental awareness began processing information that Thomas couldn't have accounted for: the acoustic properties of the amphitheater, wind patterns that would affect explosive placement, subtle visual cues that revealed human activity in specific areas. Within minutes, Alex had identified the likely locations of all 3 charges. Thomas had positioned them well, but not perfectly. There were gaps in coverage, areas where careful movement might avoid triggering the devices. More importantly, Alex's spatial memory revealed something that Thomas couldn't have known. The drainage route connected to a larger cave system that honeycombed this section of the mountains. Underground passages that would provide complete concealment from both visual observation and explosive devices. "I've made my decision," Alex announced. "Excellent. I'm genuinely curious to hear your choice." Alex helped Sarah to her feet and began moving toward the concealed drainage, using available cover to mask their initial movement. "I'm going to demonstrate exactly what I'm capable of," Alex called back. "But not in the way you're expecting." Alex and Sarah reached the drainage entrance without triggering any of Thomas's explosive devices, confirming Alex's assessment of their placement. The concealed passage was narrow but navigable, leading into the mountain's interior through naturally carved rock channels. "Impressive movement, Mr. Morgan," Thomas's voice echoed from above, though with a note of concern. "However, that drainage leads to a dead end approximately 50 yards inside the mountain. You've trapped yourself in a location with no alternate exits." Alex smiled grimly as he guided Sarah into the passage. Thomas's intelligence gathering had been extensive but not complete. The cave system's full extent wasn't documented in any Park Service records, known only to someone who'd spent years exploring every corner of this wilderness. "Thomas Reed," Alex called back as they moved deeper into the mountain. "You made one critical error in your research." "Which was?" "You studied my service record and my documented capabilities, but you never understood what I learned during those years in the wilderness." Alex and Sarah reached a junction where the drainage connected to a larger cave passage, exactly as Alex's spatial memory had predicted. "I learned that predators like you always have one fatal weakness," Alex continued, his voice now echoing from inside the mountain. "You underestimate the people you try to control." The larger cave system provided multiple passage options, including routes that would emerge miles away from Thomas's position. But more importantly, it offered something that Alex recognized as a decisive tactical advantage. "You want to know what authentic human capability looks like under extreme conditions?" Alex called out. "You're about to find out." Instead of continuing toward distant exits, Alex guided Sarah toward a passage that led back toward the surface, but in a location that Thomas couldn't have anticipated. Alex's years of exploration had revealed access points throughout the cave system, including several that emerged behind Thomas's current position. "Alex," Sarah whispered, "are we really going back toward him?" "Sometimes the best way to escape a predator is to become the hunter," Alex replied, his enhanced environmental awareness now providing precise information about Thomas's location and movement patterns. They moved through the cave system with careful precision, Alex's natural navigation abilities guiding them through passages that seemed impossible to navigate without detailed maps. But Alex's spatial memory held every turn, every junction, every potential hazard. 20 minutes later, they emerged from a concealed cave entrance approximately 100 yards behind Thomas's sniper position. Alex could see him clearly now. A man in his 40s, athletic build, professional-grade equipment, positioned exactly where Alex's environmental awareness had indicated. But Thomas was focused on the amphitheater below, still waiting for Alex and Sarah to emerge from the drainage that he believed was a trap. "Sarah," Alex whispered, "there's a trail marker about 50 yards behind us. Follow it back toward the main hiking trails. When you reach other people, tell them to contact Park Service and report our location." "What about you?" Thomas Reed wanted to test authentic human capabilities. "I'm going to give him exactly what he asked for." Alex moved toward Thomas's position with all the skills that had made him exceptional during his Ranger years. Silent movement, perfect concealment, tactical awareness that allowed him to approach an armed opponent without detection. But as he closed the distance, Alex realized that Thomas's psychological profile was more complex than simple predator behavior. This was someone who'd been twisted by genuine trauma, whose military experience had provided deadly skills, but whose psychological framework had been shattered by experiences that exceeded normal human endurance. Alex reached a position directly behind Thomas's concealment, close enough to see the detailed preparation that had gone into this ambush. Professional-grade rifle, high-quality optics, multiple ammunition types, backup weapons, communication equipment. This was someone who'd planned extensively for armed confrontation. But Thomas was still focused on the amphitheater below, expecting Alex to emerge from the drainage that had appeared to be their only escape route. "Thomas Reed," Alex said quietly. Thomas spun around, bringing his rifle up with practiced speed. But he was positioned for long-range engagement, not close-quarters confrontation. Alex's approach had eliminated his primary tactical advantage. "Exceptional fieldcraft, Mr. Morgan," Thomas said, his voice carrying genuine admiration despite the tactical reversal. "I underestimated your knowledge of local terrain features." "You underestimated a lot of things," Alex replied, maintaining careful distance while assessing Thomas's potential reactions. For the first time, Alex could see his opponent clearly. Mid-40s, weathered features that suggested extensive outdoor experience. Eyes that showed intelligence mixed with something that might have been madness, but also something else. A kind of desperate loneliness that explained his twisted need for human contact through elaborate psychological games. 18 months alone in those mountains, Thomas continued, his rifle still trained on Alex, but his tone becoming conversational. 18 months of discovering what humans become when everything civilized disappears. What did you become? Someone who understood that most people are living comfortable lies. That civilization has made humanity weak, dependent, incapable of authentic survival. Thomas's voice carried the conviction of someone who'd built an entire worldview around traumatic experience. But you also became someone who terrorizes innocent people. I became someone who reveals truth, who shows people what they're truly capable of when comfortable illusions are stripped away. Alex could see the psychological framework that supported Thomas's actions. Genuine trauma transformed into a philosophical justification for predatory behavior. Military training and survival experience had provided the skills, but underlying psychological damage had provided the motivation. What happened to your unit, Thomas? Thomas's expression shifted, showing pain that ran deeper than simple loss. Ambushed in terrain similar to this, complex attack, well planned, executed by opponents who understood our capabilities and prepared countermeasures. And you survived. I survived because I was positioned for Overwatch, exactly like this. I had clear sight lines, good cover, sufficient ammunition to hold position indefinitely. Thomas's voice carried self-recrimination that explained his psychological transformation. But you didn't help them. I made tactical assessments, calculated probability of successful intervention versus likelihood of additional casualties, determined that individual survival took precedence over group cohesion. Alex understood now. Thomas had watched his unit die while making logical decisions that haunted him afterward. Survival guilt had twisted into a philosophy that justified abandoning human connections entirely. So you've been testing other people the same way you tested yourself. I've been documenting authentic human behavior under survival conditions, separating those who possess genuine capability from those who collapse when external support disappears, and killing the ones who don't meet your standards. Thomas's rifle barrel remained steady, but his psychological condition was clearly unstable. Years of isolation and guilt had created a worldview that required constant validation through deadly experiments. I'm not a killer, Mr. Morgan. I'm a researcher documenting human potential under extreme conditions. You're someone who's been alone too long and created a philosophy that justifies predatory behavior. Alex saw Thomas's finger move slightly on the trigger, recognizing the signs of someone whose psychological control was slipping. But Thomas's tactical position, while excellent for long-range engagement, had limitations at close quarters. Alex's wilderness experience included techniques for dealing with armed opponents, skills developed during years of potentially dangerous encounters with poachers and disturbed individuals. "Your research ends here, Thomas," Alex said, his voice carrying the authority he'd developed through years of crisis management. "Sarah Chen is safe. Other people know our location. This confrontation ends with your surrender or your death." "Surrender isn't a viable option," Thomas replied, his tactical assessment overriding emotional considerations. "My research is too important to be terminated by conventional law enforcement." Alex realized that Thomas's psychological condition made negotiation impossible. Years of isolation and guilt had created a mental framework that required continued validation through predatory behavior. But Thomas had made a critical tactical error. His fascination with Alex's capabilities had led him to engage in extended conversation rather than taking immediate action. Psychological curiosity had overridden tactical discipline. Alex moved sideways, using natural cover to limit Thomas's shooting angles while closing distance. His environmental awareness provided precise information about terrain features that could be used for concealment or tactical advantage. "Remarkable movement skills," Thomas said, tracking Alex through his rifle scope, but finding clear shots increasingly difficult. "You're demonstrating exactly the kind of capabilities I've been documenting." "Then document this," Alex said, disappearing behind a large boulder that blocked Thomas's line of sight. Thomas repositioned quickly, trying to re-establish visual contact, but Alex's natural navigation abilities allowed him to predict exactly where Thomas would move. The tactical situation had shifted from long-range engagement to close-quarters maneuvering, where Alex's wilderness skills provided decisive advantages. Alex emerged from concealment at an angle that Thomas hadn't anticipated, closing distance to within 30 yards. Thomas fired once, the shot missing wide as Alex used terrain masking to disrupt targeting. "Your research methodology has a fatal flaw, Thomas," Alex called out, while continuing to close distance. "You've been studying people in isolation, but human survival has always been based on cooperation." Alex reached a position where Thomas's rifle became tactically ineffective, too close for accurate shooting, but too far for hand-to-hand combat. Thomas drew a sidearm, showing the kind of weapons handling that confirmed extensive military training. But Thomas's psychological condition was deteriorating rapidly under pressure. Years of isolation had created mental habits that became liabilities during actual confrontation. 18 months alone taught you survival techniques," Alex continued, using conversation to maintain psychological pressure while maneuvering for tactical advantage. "But it also taught you to think like prey rather than predator." Thomas fired twice with his sidearm, both shots missing as Alex used natural cover and unpredictable movement patterns. "You've been hiding in the wilderness, conducting experiments on isolated individuals because genuine confrontation terrifies you," Alex said, his voice carrying psychological insight that cut deeper than physical threats. Thomas's shooting became increasingly erratic as Alex's psychological assessment triggered emotional reactions that interfered with tactical performance. "You didn't stay behind during that ambush to provide overwatch," Alex continued, closing distance while Thomas struggled to maintain effective fire. "You stayed behind because you were afraid." Thomas's tactical discipline finally collapsed completely. Instead of maintaining distance and using his weapons effectively, he abandoned his position and charged directly at Alex. His psychological control shattered by accurate psychological assessment. Alex met Thomas's charge using techniques developed during years of wilderness encounters with dangerous wildlife. Controlled violence, precise application of force, tactical awareness that allowed him to neutralize threats without unnecessary escalation. The confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. Thomas's military training had provided sophisticated weapon skills, but his psychological condition had undermined the discipline necessary for close combat. Alex's wilderness experience included techniques for dealing with predators that were far more dangerous than psychologically damaged humans. Thomas lay unconscious in the snow, his weapons scattered, his elaborate research project terminated by someone who understood that authentic human capability included the strength to protect others from predators like him. Alex retrieved Thomas's communication equipment and contacted Park Service Dispatch, providing precise coordinates for their location and requesting immediate assistance. Sarah's earlier escape would have already triggered search and rescue operations, but Thomas needed medical attention and secure custody. As Alex waited for help to arrive, he examined Thomas's research materials, notebooks filled with detailed observations of human behavior under extreme stress, psychological profiles of previous victims, tactical plans for future experiments. The depth of preparation was disturbing, but it also revealed the profound loneliness and psychological damage that had driven Thomas's predatory behavior. Thomas regained consciousness as the first rescue helicopters appeared in the distance, their rotors echoing off the surrounding peaks. His eyes focused on Alex with expression that mixed defeat with something that might have been relief. 18 months alone in those mountains, Thomas said quietly, his voice now stripped of the clinical detachment that had characterized their earlier conversation. "I know," Alex replied, helping Thomas to a sitting position despite everything that had happened. "You don't know," Thomas continued. "You don't know what it does to someone, that level of isolation, that complete separation from human connection." Alex looked at Thomas's research materials, understanding now that the elaborate experiments had been desperate attempts to recreate human contact, even through predatory relationships. "There were other ways to reconnect," Alex said. "Were there? After what I did? After watching my unit die while I calculated survival probabilities instead of taking action?" The helicopters were closer now, their sound growing louder as rescue teams approached the amphitheater. "Yes," Alex said simply. "There were other ways." Thomas nodded slowly, looking at his hands as if seeing them clearly for the first time in years. "Your research was wrong about one thing," Alex added as Park Service personnel rappelled from the helicopters. "Human survival isn't about individual capability. It's about cooperation, protection, connection." Thomas looked up at the rescue teams working with practiced efficiency to secure the area and provide medical assistance. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe you're right." As Thomas was loaded into the rescue helicopter, Alex realized that the encounter had revealed something important about his own capabilities. The wilderness skills that had made him exceptional as a ranger weren't just technical abilities. They were expressions of a fundamental commitment to protecting others, to maintaining the human connections that Thomas had abandoned. Sarah Chen was found safe at the trail marker Alex had indicated, suffering from exposure and dehydration, but otherwise unharmed. Her 3 days of captivity had been terrifying, but her survival demonstrated exactly the kind of human resilience that Thomas had been trying to document through his twisted experiments. During the helicopter flight back to the Park Service headquarters, Alex looked out at the wilderness landscape that had been the setting for Thomas's psychological research project. Beautiful, dangerous, capable of revealing both the best and worst aspects of human nature. But ultimately, Alex realized, the wilderness was just a setting. The real test of human capability wasn't surviving in isolation, it was maintaining connection and protecting others, even when that required confronting the kind of predators that civilization sometimes created. Thomas Reed would spend the rest of his life in psychiatric custody, his research terminated, but his psychological damage serving as a reminder that authentic human survival required more than individual skills. It required the strength to remain human even under the most extreme conditions. Alex returned to his cabin that evening, exhausted but oddly satisfied. The encounter had tested every ability he possessed, pushed him to limits he'd never reached during his ranger service, and revealed capabilities he'd never fully understood. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that authentic human strength wasn't about surviving alone. It was about maintaining the connections and commitments that made survival worthwhile. Outside his windows, the wilderness stretched endlessly under starlight, beautiful and dangerous and eternal. But Alex no longer saw it as a place of testing or research. He saw it as home, as the landscape where he'd learned what he was truly capable of when someone needed protection from the predators that haunted both wilderness and civilization. The phone rang once before Alex fell asleep, another call for help from someone lost in the darkness. He answered immediately, already reaching for his equipment. Some people were born to hunt, others were born to protect. Alex Morgan had finally understood which one he was. The emergency call came at 5:47 a.m., cutting through Luke Hansen's coffee-scented morning routine like a blade through bark. 3 family members missing in the Great Smoky Mountains: the Kellys, a father, mother, and teenage daughter from Nashville who'd been camping near Cataract Falls. Last seen yesterday evening. Local search and rescue was requesting his expertise. Luke set down his mug and reached for his gear bag, muscle memory guiding his hands through the familiar ritual: headlamp, GPS unit, first aid kit, emergency shelter, rope, knife. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. 5 years as a park ranger had taught him that preparation meant the difference between bringing people home and bringing back bodies. The drive to the trailhead took 40 minutes through winding mountain roads lined with bare maples and oaks. November in Tennessee meant early darkness and temperatures that could drop 30 degrees without warning. The missing family had picked a dangerous time to camp, especially with the weather service predicting an unseasonable cold front moving in. Luke parked next to 2 Park Service vehicles and a county sheriff's truck. The search coordinator, a young ranger named Sarah Mills, briefed him quickly. "We found their campsite abandoned around midnight, tents still up, food scattered, no signs of struggle. But here's the weird part. Their gear is missing. Backpacks, sleeping bags, everything valuable. Could be they packed up and got disoriented. Or someone else packed for them," Luke said, studying the topographical map spread across the truck's hood. He traced the area around Cataract Falls with his finger, noting the steep terrain and thick canopy that would make helicopter searches nearly impossible. "Show me the site." The campsite sat in a small clearing beside Abrams Creek, surrounded by towering pines and thick undergrowth. Luke approached slowly, letting his trained eyes catalog every detail. The scattered food looked deliberate rather than random: a can of beans placed carefully beside a fallen log, a half-eaten energy bar positioned on a flat rock. Animals would have dragged food in different directions, not arranged it like breadcrumbs. He knelt beside the nearest tent and examined the ground. The soil told its story in pressed earth and disturbed leaves. 3 sets of boots had walked around the tents in the early morning hours when dew would have made the ground soft. But there was something else. A 4th set of prints that appeared and disappeared like ghost tracks. Luke's exceptional tracking ability had always been his strongest skill, the one that made other rangers seek his help on difficult cases. He could read sign that others missed entirely: the slight displacement of a pebble, the unnatural bend of a twig, the way morning light caught a partial footprint in damp earth. Now, crouching beside the abandoned campsite, he saw what the local team had missed. The 4th person had been here first. The boot prints were deeper at the heel, indicating someone carrying extra weight. Military-style boots, size 11, with a distinctive wear pattern on the outside edge that suggested a slight limp. This person had circled the campsite multiple times before the family ever arrived, selecting the perfect observation points in the surrounding trees. "Sarah," Luke called softly, "come look at this." She approached, her breath visible in the morning cold. "What is it?" Someone was watching them. See these prints? They're underneath the family's tracks. Whoever it was had been here for hours before the Kellys made camp. Sarah's face paled. You think they were taken? Luke stood, brushing dirt from his knees. The forest around them had fallen unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no scurrying in the underbrush. His second ability, reading nature's subtle signals, told him something fundamental had changed in this ecosystem. Animals fled from apex predators, and right now, every creature within a half-mile radius was hiding. I think they're being hunted, he said. The trail led northeast toward the higher elevations, marked by broken branches and disturbed leaves that formed an almost obvious path. Too obvious. Luke had tracked panicked hikers before, and they didn't leave sign this clear or move this purposefully through difficult terrain. Someone wanted to be followed. He moved carefully, pausing every few yards to listen and observe. The forest felt wrong, not just quiet, but actively hostile. Years of working in these mountains had given Luke an almost supernatural sense for the wilderness's moods. Today, the Smokies felt like they were holding their breath. A mile up the trail, he found the first deliberate message. 3 stones had been carefully arranged in a triangle beside a massive oak tree, each one placed with geometric precision. This wasn't random. Luke photographed the formation with his phone and continued tracking, his unease growing with each step. The boot prints became more erratic now, sometimes doubling back, sometimes disappearing entirely on rocky ground before reappearing yards away. Whoever was making this trail possessed advanced wilderness skills, someone who understood tracking as well as Luke did, but from the opposite perspective. A hunter who knew how to lead prey exactly where he wanted them to go. By noon, Luke had climbed nearly 2,000 feet. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the sky was darkening with approaching storm clouds. He checked his GPS and realized the trail was leading toward Thunderhead Mountain, one of the most remote and dangerous sections of the park. That's when he found the backpack. It hung from a low branch like a grotesque ornament, positioned at perfect eye level for someone following the trail. A child's Disney-themed backpack that had to belong to the teenage daughter. Luke photographed it before carefully lifting it down, his hands steady despite the chill running down his spine. The backpack was empty except for a single piece of paper folded neatly in the main compartment. Luke unfolded it with growing dread and found a message written in precise block letters. Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Hansen. 5 years as a ranger, specializing in search and rescue, with a 97% success rate finding lost hikers. I've been studying your methods. Consider this an examination of your abilities. The Kellys are alive, for now. Follow the trail. Prove you deserve to save them. TB. Luke's third ability kicked in like ice water in his veins. Human presence detection had saved his life more than once during his ranger years, warning him when poachers were nearby or when someone was watching from the tree line. Now, every nerve in his body screamed danger. He was being observed, studied, analyzed like a specimen under a microscope. He turned slowly, scanning the forest around him. Nothing moved, but the sensation persisted. Intelligent, malevolent eyes tracking his every movement. Whoever TB was, he was close enough to watch Luke's reactions to see how he handled finding the backpack and the message. Luke pocketed the note and continued up the trail, moving with the fluid confidence that had made him the park's most requested tracker. But inside, his mind was racing. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. Someone had researched him, planned this encounter, turned a search and rescue mission into a personal challenge. The afternoon grew colder and darker as the trail led into increasingly treacherous terrain. Luke's GPS signal flickered and died. Not unusual in the deep mountains, but the timing felt suspicious. He switched to navigation by compass and landmark, relying on his fourth ability. natural orientation that let him maintain perfect directional sense even in complete darkness. 2 hours later, he found the second message. This one was carved into the bark of a dead chestnut tree, the letters still weeping sap. Most people panic when their technology fails. You adapt. Interesting. The real test begins now. Luke studied the carving, noting the tool marks. A fixed blade knife, sharp enough to cut cleanly through bark without ragged edges. Military or tactical grade. The letters were carved with the same precise, methodical spacing as the handwriting on the paper. A sound echoed through the forest, distant but unmistakable. A human voice calling for help. Luke's investigative intuition, honed by hundreds of successful rescues, immediately flagged the call as wrong. The voice carried too far, too clearly through the thick forest. In genuine panic, people's voices became hoarse and strained. This call had the practiced projection of someone trained in wilderness survival. But even knowing it was a trap, Luke had to follow. 3 innocent lives hung in the balance. The voice led him off the main trail into a narrow ravine choked with rhododendron and mountain laurel. The vegetation grew so thick that Luke had to force his way through, branches catching at his clothes and scratching his face. The voice called out every few minutes, always from just ahead, always out of sight. As darkness began to fall, Luke realized he'd been led in a wide circle. His spatial memory, the last and most reliable of his abilities, painted a perfect mental map of his route. He was less than half a mile from where he'd found the first message, but the terrain and thick vegetation made it feel like a different world. That's when he saw the light. A small campfire flickered through the trees, sending orange shadows dancing across the trunks. Luke approached cautiously, using every stealth technique he'd learned during his ranger training. As he drew closer, he could see 3 figures huddled around the fire, a man, woman, and teenage girl, the Kellys, alive. But as Luke crept within 50 yards of the camp, his presence detection ability screamed a warning so intense it nearly made him stumble. Someone else was here, hidden, watching both the family and Luke himself. The setup was perfect, 3 victims positioned as bait, with Luke caught between them and an unseen predator. Mr. Hansen, the voice came from directly behind him, calm and conversational. Please don't make any sudden movements. Luke froze, his hand halfway to the radio on his belt. The voice belonged to a middle-aged man with a slight southern accent, educated but with military precision in his diction. Turn around slowly. Keep your hands visible. Luke complied, rotating carefully until he faced his captor. The man was tall and lean, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. He wore military surplus clothing and carried a tactical knife with casual familiarity. Despite the weapon, his posture suggested confidence rather than aggression. Thomas Blackwood, the man said, extending his free hand as if they were meeting at a dinner party. Though I suppose you've already deduced that from my initials. Luke didn't shake the offered hand. Let the family go. Your issue is with me. My issue? Blackwood smiled, an expression that held no warmth. Mr. Hansen, you misunderstand the situation entirely. This isn't about revenge or personal grievance. This is about necessity. He gestured for Luke to sit on a fallen log, keeping the knife visible but not threatening. You see, I've spent the last 3 years studying modern search and rescue techniques, reading case files, analyzing success rates, identifying the most skilled practitioners. Your name kept appearing at the top of every list. What do you want? To test you, to see if your reputation is deserved or merely bureaucratic inflation. Blackwood's eyes gleamed with scientific curiosity. Modern civilization has made humans weak, dependent on technology and comfort. Most people couldn't survive a single night in true wilderness. But you're different. You still have the instincts our ancestors needed to survive. Luke glanced toward the campfire where the Kellys sat motionless. Are they hurt? Sedated? They'll wake up with headaches and no memory of the last 12 hours. Assuming, of course, that you prove worthy of saving them. And if I don't? Blackwood's expression didn't change. Then Darwin was right about natural selection. For the first time in years, Luke felt genuinely afraid, not of physical danger, but of the calculating intelligence behind those cold eyes. This wasn't a man driven by passion or desperation. He was methodical, patient, utterly convinced of his own righteousness. "You're insane," Luke said quietly. "Am I?" Blackwood leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone of a lecture. 2 years ago, I was leading survival training exercises for military special forces. Good men, trained warriors, the best our civilization could produce. Then our helicopter went down in the Brooks Range of Alaska. No radio, no GPS, no rescue beacon. His eyes grew distant, lost in memory. 14 of us survived the crash. By the time I walked out 6 weeks later, I was alone. 13 trained soldiers dead because they couldn't adapt when their technology failed them. They starved in a land of plenty because they'd forgotten how to truly see, to hunt, to become part of the wilderness instead of fighting it. So you decided to play God. I decided to become evolution's instrument. Blackwood's voice hardened. Every month, thousands of people venture into wilderness areas with no understanding of the forces they're entering. They expect to be rescued when they make mistakes, to be saved from their own weakness. You enable that dependence, Mr. Hansen. You make it possible for the unworthy to survive. Luke studied his captor's face, recognizing the fervor of true belief. This wasn't random madness. It was philosophy twisted into action by trauma and isolation. And the test? Simple. Prove you deserve to save them. Show me that your skills go beyond reading GPS coordinates and following radio calls. Blackwood stood and backed toward the tree line. You have until dawn to reach the Kellys. The terrain between here and there contains 12 specific challenges I've prepared. Navigate them successfully, and everyone goes home. Fail, and natural selection takes its course. What kind of challenges? But Blackwood was already melting into the darkness, his voice floating back through the trees. The kind that separate survivors from statistics, Mr. Hansen. Good hunting. Luke was alone. He checked his watch. 7:30 p.m. Sunrise wouldn't come until nearly 7 a.m., giving him less than 12 hours to cover unknown ground filled with deliberately placed obstacles. The temperature was dropping fast, and the storm clouds he'd noticed earlier were gathering overhead. Luke activated his headlamp and approached the campfire. The Kellys were breathing steadily, their faces peaceful in chemically induced sleep. He checked their pulses and found them strong and regular. Whatever Blackwood had used, it wasn't immediately life-threatening. But leaving them here wasn't an option. The approaching storm would bring freezing temperatures, and unconscious people couldn't regulate their body heat effectively. Luke gathered fallen branches and built up the fire, then arranged the sleeping forms in a tight group to conserve warmth. As he worked, his mind analyzed Blackwood's challenge. 12 specific obstacles suggested a planned course, probably marked in some way. The man had demonstrated superior wilderness skills and intimate knowledge of this terrain. He wouldn't have left anything to chance. Luke began searching the perimeter of the camp and quickly found what he was looking for. A small cairn of stacked stones about 30 yards north of the fire. Beside it, another carved message. Challenge 1. Find the path when there is no path. Trust your instincts over your instruments. Luke examined the ground around the cairn but found no obvious trail. The forest floor was covered in a thick carpet of leaves that showed no sign of disturbance. But as he played his headlamp across the surrounding trees, he noticed something subtle. A pattern in the way branches had been broken, creating sight lines that led deeper into the forest. His tracking ability had evolved during his ranger years from simple footprint reading to environmental interpretation. Now he followed the broken branch pattern, moving from one slight disturbance to the next. The path was there, invisible to casual observation, but clear to someone who understood how wilderness signs could be manipulated. The first real obstacle appeared after 10 minutes of careful navigation. A cliff face rising 20 feet above a narrow stream. In daylight, Luke could have found a way around. In darkness, with time pressure, the vertical route was the only option. Free climbing by headlamp violated every safety protocol Luke knew. But Blackwood had chosen this challenge specifically to test risk assessment under pressure. Luke studied the rock face, identifying hand and footholds, planning his route before beginning the ascent. The climb took 15 precious minutes, his fingers growing numb in the cold air. When he reached the top, he found the second cairn waiting. Challenge 2. Cross the bridge that isn't there. Luke's headlamp beam revealed the challenge immediately. A fallen tree had been positioned across a deep gully, but the trunk was too narrow to walk on and too far above the ground to jump safely. Below, the sound of running water suggested a significant drop. Then he spotted the rope. A climbing rope had been anchored to a tree on his side of the gully and stretched across to the far side, parallel to the fallen trunk, but about 3 feet higher. Blackwood wanted him to traverse hand over hand across 40 feet of empty space. Luke tested the rope's anchor points and found them secure. His ranger training included basic rescue techniques, but this was technical climbing territory. One mistake would send him plunging into the darkness below. He wrapped his legs around the rope and began the crossing, his shoulders burning with effort as he pulled himself along. Halfway across, his headlamp flickered and died. Complete darkness. Luke hung suspended over the invisible gully, his world reduced to the feel of rope in his hands and the sound of water somewhere below. This was Blackwood's real test, not the physical challenge, but the psychological pressure of continuing when technology failed. Luke closed his eyes and relied on his natural orientation ability. He knew which direction he needed to go, could feel the slight upward angle of the rope as it approached the far anchor. Moving by touch alone, he completed the traverse and dropped onto solid ground. The third cairn was waiting. You're learning. 7 more challenges ahead. The Kelly's body temperature drops 2 degrees per hour. Luke's blood ran cold. If Blackwood wasn't bluffing, the sedated family would begin suffering hypothermia within hours. The fire would burn down, and unconscious people couldn't generate heat through movement. Every minute of delay brought them closer to death. The challenges became increasingly complex as Luke pushed deeper into Blackwood's course. Challenge 4 required him to decode a message using tree bark patterns. Challenge 5 forced him to cross a partially frozen pond by reading ice thickness in darkness. Challenge 6 involved following animal tracks to find a hidden cache of supplies that included a backup headlamp and a thermos of hot coffee. The coffee was still warm. Luke realized that Blackwood was shadowing his progress, staying close enough to monitor his performance. The thought of being watched added another layer of psychological pressure, but it also revealed something important. Blackwood was genuinely invested in this test. He wanted Luke to succeed, to prove worthy of his respect. Challenge 7 nearly killed him. Luke found himself at the edge of a steep ravine filled with loose scree and hidden rocks. The only way down was a controlled slide that required perfect timing and balance. One wrong move would send him tumbling into boulders that could crush bones or split skulls. He made the descent by feel, using his feet to test each step, his hands trailing along rock faces for support. When he reached the bottom, his watch showed 3:30 a.m. Time was running out. Challenges 8 through 11 blurred together in a nightmare of physical and mental tests. Navigating by starlight through a maze of fallen trees, solving a wilderness puzzle that required understanding of local wildlife behavior, crossing a swollen creek on slippery stones, and climbing through a cave system that tested his claustrophobia as much as his route-finding skills. By the time Luke reached the 12th challenge, dawn was breaking through the forest canopy. He was exhausted, hypothermic, and running on pure determination. His watch showed 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes until sunrise, 15 minutes until Blackwood's deadline. The final challenge was the simplest and most profound, a single message carved into a tree beside a familiar path. Challenge 12. Remember why you became a ranger. What separated you from those who quit during training? Your spatial memory holds the key to reaching them in time. Luke's spatial memory kicked in like a searchlight illuminating a map. Every step of his journey through Blackwood's obstacle course had been carefully planned to bring him to this exact spot, a location he recognized from years earlier. 3 years ago, he had rescued a lost child from this very area. The boy had wandered off from a family camping trip and spent 2 nights alone in the forest before Luke tracked him down. The rescue had required navigating through thick undergrowth to reach a hidden clearing where the child had taken shelter. That clearing was less than a quarter mile from here. That's where Blackwood had taken the Kellys. Luke ran through the forest with desperate energy, his body finding reserves he didn't know existed. Branches tore at his clothes and roots tried to trip him, but his memory guided him around every obstacle. He knew this terrain, had memorized every tree and rock during one of the most important rescues of his career. The clearing appeared exactly where his memory said it would be, but something was wrong. The campfire had burned down to cold ashes, and the Kellys were nowhere to be seen. Then Luke heard the voice behind him. "Impressive, Mr. Hansen. 11 hours and 37 minutes. I calculated 12 hours as the minimum time for someone of your abilities." Blackwood stepped into the clearing, no longer carrying the knife. His expression held something Luke hadn't expected, genuine admiration. "Where are they?" Luke demanded. "Safe, warming up in a heated shelter about 200 yards from here. I moved them an hour ago when it became clear you would succeed." Blackwood sat on a fallen log and studied Luke's battered appearance. "Tell me, what did you learn about yourself during the night?" Luke stared at his tormentor, anger and exhaustion warring in his chest. "That you're a sick bastard who gets off on playing God with innocent people. And that I'm tougher than I thought. That my training and experience mean something. That I won't quit when lives are at stake." Luke's voice grew stronger. "Is that what you wanted to hear?" Blackwood nodded slowly. "It's what I needed to confirm. You see, Mr. Hansen, you represent something I thought was extinct in modern humans. Genuine competence earned through real adversity. Most rescue workers rely on technology and backup support. You trust your own abilities. So this was all some twisted job interview?" "In a way." Blackwood stood and walked to the edge of the clearing. "I've been searching for someone worthy of inheriting my knowledge. Someone who could continue the work of separating the worthy from the weak, but with wisdom instead of my extremism." Luke felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning cold. "You want me to become like you?" "I want you to become better than me." Blackwood's voice carried a note of sad regret. "My methods are flawed, born from trauma and isolation. I became so focused on testing strength that I forgot to value compassion. But you have both. You could refine the concept, find ways to challenge people without destroying them." "Never." Blackwood smiled, the expression almost fatherly. "I hoped you'd say that. It confirms my assessment of your character." He reached into his jacket and pulled out Luke's radio, the one that had been taken during their first encounter. "The Kellys are in a warming hut at coordinates 35.6344, 834826. They'll wake up naturally in about an hour with no memory of this experience. Luke grabbed the radio but kept his eyes on Blackwood. What about you? I have one more test to complete, the most important one. Blackwood pulled out a flare gun and fired a red signal into the morning sky. I'm calling in my own rescue team. Time to face the consequences of my choices. Why? Because you taught me something I'd forgotten, Mr. Hansen. True strength isn't about surviving in isolation. It's about saving others even when it costs you everything. That's a lesson worth dying for. Within minutes, the sound of helicopters filled the air. Blackwood sat calmly on his log as armed federal agents surrounded the clearing. He made no attempt to resist as they placed him in restraints. As they led him away, he called back to Luke. The worthy don't survive by stepping on others, Hansen. They survive by lifting them up. Remember that. Luke found the Kellys exactly where Blackwood had promised. They were groggy but unharmed, with no memory of their ordeal beyond making camp the first evening. The family was evacuated by helicopter, and Luke gave his statement to federal investigators who seemed both impressed and disturbed by his account of the night's events. 3 months later, Luke received a letter forwarded through the federal prison system. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message in familiar block letters. Mr. Hansen, I've been sentenced to life without parole for kidnapping and multiple other charges. I'm using my time to write a manual on wilderness survival techniques, with proceeds going to search and rescue training programs. Perhaps some good can come from my mistakes. You proved that strength and compassion can coexist. Thank you for the lesson. TB. Luke burned the letter, but he kept the lesson. 6 months after the ordeal, he returned to active ranger duty with a new perspective on his calling. He still tracked lost hikers and coordinated rescues, but now he also taught wilderness survival courses that emphasized both practical skills and ethical decision-making. His students learned not just how to survive in the wild, but why survival was worth the effort. The test had ended, but the teaching continued. In his darkest moments, Luke remembered Blackwood's final words about lifting others up instead of stepping on them. The man had been twisted by trauma and isolation, but his core insight remained valid. True strength revealed itself not in the ability to survive alone, but in the willingness to ensure others survived as well. Luke had passed Blackwood's test not by matching his ruthlessness, but by maintaining his humanity under extreme pressure. That was the lesson worth learning, the wisdom worth teaching. The worthy don't just survive, they make survival possible for others. That was a truth worth living for. Daniel Hayes checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes, 6:47 a.m. The missing persons report had come in at midnight. 3 members of a geological survey team, overdue by 18 hours from their planned return to Cataract Falls trailhead. Standard protocol demanded a dawn search, and Dan had volunteered despite being officially retired from the Park Service for 2 years now. He methodically packed his gear in the pre-dawn darkness of the parking lot. GPS unit, emergency medical supplies, rope, headlamp, extra batteries. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from 5 years as a ranger and countless search operations. The familiar weight of the pack settled across his shoulders like an old friend. The October air carried that sharp bite that meant winter was prowling just beyond the ridgelines. Leaves crunched under his boots as he approached the trailhead, mostly yellow and brown now, with occasional flashes of red maple that looked black in his flashlight beam. By 7:15, Dan was moving up the trail at a steady pace, his breathing controlled, senses already expanding beyond the narrow cone of his light. 30 minutes in, he found the survey team's first camp. 3 tents arranged in a perfect triangle, guy lines taut, camp stove properly secured. Everything exactly as it should be, except for the silence. Dan had been around enough camps to know their rhythms, the subtle sounds of nylon shifting with temperature changes, the faint tick of cooling metal. the whisper of wind through properly tensioned fabric. This camp was too quiet. He knelt beside the cold fire ring and placed his palm just above the ashes. No residual warmth, but the ash pattern suggested the fire had burned normally before being properly extinguished. Professional campers. His flashlight swept the area methodically, and that's when his first ability kicked in almost unconsciously. The footprints around the camp were wrong. Dan had been reading tracks since he was 12 years old, trained by his grandfather who could follow a deer trail 3 days old through a rainstorm. These prints told a story that didn't match the neat camp. 3 sets leading in, 2 size 10 boots, and 1 smaller, maybe an 8. But leading out, only 2 sets of the original prints plus something else, a 3rd set but different boots, heavier, military-style tread pattern. He photographed the prints with his phone, then followed the outbound trail. The original 2 sets walked normally for about 50 yards, then their gait changed. Longer strides, feet landing more toward the balls. They'd started moving faster, not quite running, but close. The 3rd set of prints stayed calm, measured, confident. By 8:30, Dan had followed the trail to a creek crossing where it disappeared into the rocky stream bed. Standard tracking procedure would be to search both banks for where they emerged, but something made him pause. The morning was too still. He'd been hiking for an hour and hadn't heard a single bird call, not even the rustle of a squirrel. In October, these woods should be alive with animals gathering food for winter. His second ability whispered a warning. After 5 years of reading the Smokies' moods, Dan could sense when the ecosystem was disturbed. Animals fled before predators, went silent before storms, changed their patterns when something was fundamentally wrong in their territory. The wrongness here felt deliberate, as if something had systematically cleared the wildlife from this area. Dan pulled out his radio to contact base camp, but got only static. He was still within range. The dead zone didn't start for another 2 miles. He tried his cell phone. No signal, though he'd had 3 bars at the trailhead. Equipment failures happened, but rarely both simultaneously. He was checking his GPS unit when his 3rd ability kicked in with the force of a gut punch. Someone was watching him. The sensation started as a cold weight between his shoulder blades, then spread outward until his entire back felt exposed. Dan had experienced this feeling maybe a dozen times in his ranger career, always in situations that later proved dangerous. Drug operations, armed poachers, unstable hikers. His body's early warning system had never been wrong. Without changing his pace or posture, Dan let his eyes scan the forest around him. Nothing visible, but the feeling intensified. Whoever was out there was good. Most people betrayed their presence through unconscious movement or poor positioning. This felt professional. Dan continued upstream, but now his movements had purpose beyond tracking. He stayed close to cover, used the creek's noise to mask his footsteps, and began employing techniques his grandfather had taught him for hunting animals that might be hunting him back. At 9:15, he found the geological team's equipment cache. It was laid out with military precision on a flat section of granite beside the creek. 3 backpacks, contents sorted into neat piles. Clothing, personal items, scientific equipment, food, everything organized by category and type. The arrangement was too perfect, too deliberate. This wasn't the result of someone hastily searching the packs. Someone had taken time to inventory everything, to understand exactly what kind of people they were dealing with. Dan's investigative intuition, his 4th ability, began connecting patterns that should have been invisible. The arrangement of items wasn't random. The personal effects were grouped to reveal maximum information about each team member. Photographs positioned to show family relationships. Medications that revealed health conditions. Even the way the scientific equipment was sorted suggested someone with advanced knowledge was evaluating the team's expertise. Someone had been profiling them. A branch snapped behind him. Dan spun, hand moving instinctively to his radio, but froze when he saw what had made the sound. A hiking boot hung from a pine branch at eye level, suspended by its laces. Below it, carved into the bark with surgical precision, were 3 words: "Worthy opponent detected." The carving was fresh, sap still beading at the edges. Whoever had left this message was close, very close. Dan's mind raced through possibilities. The missing team wasn't lost, they'd been taken. The equipment cache wasn't accidental, it was a display. And now he was being drawn deeper into something that had been carefully orchestrated from the beginning. His radio crackled to life with a burst of static, then a voice emerged, calm and educated. "Mr. Hayes, I was wondering when you'd find that." Dan keyed his radio cautiously. "Who is this?" "Someone who appreciates professional competence. You've been tracking for 90 minutes, and you've already identified elements that the regular Park Service would miss entirely. Impressive work." The voice carried no accent Dan could identify, but the cadence suggested military training. Precise, economical with words, comfortable with authority. Dan began moving again, heading upstream while he talked. "Where are the 3 team members?" "Safe for now, waiting to see if you're as good as your reputation suggests." "What reputation?" A soft chuckle came through the radio. 5 years with the Park Service, 97% success rate on search and rescue operations. The Bryson City incident where you found that family after the official search was called off. The Williams case where you tracked that armed fugitive for 3 days through terrain that had the FBI stumped. Dan felt his stomach tighten. This level of research required time and resources. "What do you want?" "To test a theory. You see, Mr. Hayes, I believe that civilization has made people weak. We rely on technology, on systems, on other people to solve our problems. But in the wilderness, stripped of those crutches, a person's true nature emerges. Most people break. They panic. They make fatal mistakes. They reveal themselves as the soft, dependent creatures modern society has created." Dan reached another creek crossing and paused, ostensibly to check his GPS, but actually to scan for ambush positions. "And the theory?" "That perhaps 1 in 1,000 people are different. Authentic predators, natural survivors who think clearly under pressure and adapt to any situation. I'm curious to know which category you belong to." "Let the team go and we can discuss philosophy all you want." "Oh, they're part of the test. You see, they're not just waiting somewhere safe. They're in a situation that will deteriorate if you don't reach them within a specific time frame. Their survival depends entirely on your ability to navigate the challenges I've prepared." Dan stopped walking. The voice on the radio was too calm, too controlled. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a briefing. "What challenges?" "Nothing you haven't handled before, Mr. Hayes. Just intensified. You'll need every skill that made you the ranger other rangers called when the impossible cases came up." The radio went dead. Dan tried to raise base camp again. Nothing. He checked his GPS. The unit showed his location accurately, but the maps had been corrupted somehow. All he could see was his position as a blinking dot surrounded by blank space. Someone with serious technical knowledge had been planning this operation. He looked at his watch. 9:47 a.m. If the missing team had been taken yesterday evening, they'd been in captivity for nearly 15 hours. In October in the Smokies, with overnight temperatures dropping into the 30s, hypothermia became a real threat after 12 hours without proper shelter. Dan began moving faster, following the creek upstream toward the higher elevations. His 5th ability, natural orientation, told him he was heading roughly northwest toward the more remote sections of the park. Even without GPS, he could sense direction from subtle environmental cues. The way moss grew on trees, the angle of morning shadows, the sound of wind through different types of terrain. At 10:20, he found the first test. The trail ahead was blocked by what looked like a natural landslide, rocks and fallen trees creating an impassable barrier across the narrow canyon. But Dan's trained eye immediately spotted the problems with that interpretation. The rocks were too evenly distributed. The trees had been cut, not broken by natural forces, and there was a path around the obstruction, but it led up a steep slope that would take him away from the creek and into more dangerous terrain. A note was pinned to one of the fallen trees. The direct path is always blocked. True survivors adapt their route without losing sight of their objective. Your friends are growing cold. Dan studied the alternative path. It switchbacked up the ridge through loose shale and exposed rock faces. Dangerous terrain, especially for someone carrying a full pack, but navigable. More importantly, from the ridge he'd have a better view of the surrounding area and might be able to spot smoke from a campfire or some other sign of the missing team. He started climbing. The ascent took 40 minutes of careful work. The shale shifted under his boots, and twice he had to use his hands to maintain balance on near vertical sections. But by 11:15, Dan stood on a narrow ridge with a commanding view of the surrounding valleys. What he saw made his blood run cold. Smoke was rising from 3 different locations, spread across perhaps 2 miles of rugged terrain. 3 separate camps, or 3 separate fires. The pattern was too deliberate to be coincidental. Whoever was running this operation had scattered the team members, forcing Dan to choose which one to investigate first. His radio crackled. Difficult choice, isn't it? Where are they? Each smoke signal represents one of your missing persons, but here's the complexity of your situation, Mr. Hayes. You can only reach one before dark, and the others will not survive the night without intervention. Choose wisely. Dan studied the 3 locations through his binoculars. The nearest was maybe 2 hours away through moderate terrain. The farthest would take him at least 4 hours across some of the most difficult hiking in the park. The middle distance looked like 3 hours, but the route would take him through an area he remembered having unstable weather patterns. Why are you doing this? The voice that came back was different somehow, less controlled, more personal. Because 12 years ago, I learned that everything I believed about human nature, about justice, about the systems we trust to protect us, was a lie. Dan waited, sensing this was important. I was military intelligence, Mr. Hayes. Spent 15 years believing I was serving something greater than myself. Then I was given orders to eliminate a target who turned out to be an innocent civilian trying to expose war crimes. When I refused, my commanding officer had my entire unit marked as casualties to cover up the operation. I was the only survivor. The voice paused, and Dan could hear wind through the radio, suggesting his adversary was somewhere high and exposed. I spent 3 years trying to work within the system for justice. Courts, military tribunals, congressional hearings. Every door was closed by the same people who had ordered the murders. That's when I understood that civilization is just a facade. Underneath, we're all predators and prey. The only honest interaction is the one that happens when all the pretenses are stripped away. So, you became what you fought against. I became what I always was, Mr. Hayes. The difference is that now I'm honest about it, and I only hunt people who are strong enough to hunt me back. Most people break in the first hour. They panic, they make emotional decisions, they reveal themselves as prey. But You've been tracking me while I've been tracking you. You've adapted to every obstacle. You're thinking tactically while under pressure. Dan realized with a chill that this was true. For the past hour, he'd been unconsciously employing counter-surveillance techniques, varying his pace and route, using terrain to mask his movements. His adversary had been studying him just as carefully as he'd been studying the situation. The geological team aren't the real targets, are they? Now you're beginning to understand. They were bait to draw in someone worth testing. When the Park Service got a missing persons report, I knew they'd send their best tracker. And you, Mr. Hayes, are exactly what I was hoping for. Dan looked again at the 3 smoke signals. The tactical reality was becoming clear. This wasn't about rescuing the team members. They were pieces in a larger game, designed to force him into increasingly difficult choices. Every decision would reveal something about his character, his priorities, his problem-solving methods. But knowing the game didn't mean he could avoid playing it. 3 people were out there, and whatever his adversary's motivations, they would die without intervention. Dan chose the middle location. The decision was based on his 6th ability, spatial memory. 3 years ago, he'd worked a search and rescue operation in that area for a lost hiker. He remembered the terrain in detail, a series of interconnected ravines with multiple escape routes and natural shelter areas. If he were holding prisoners, that's where he'd want to be positioned. The radio remained silent as Dan worked his way down from the ridge and began traversing toward the target area. The terrain was exactly as he remembered. Steep ravines carved by seasonal streams, dense forest cover, limited sight lines. Perfect for an ambush, but also perfect for someone who knew how to use the environment defensively. At 1:30 p.m., Dan smelled wood smoke mixed with something else. Cooking food, but also something chemical. Medical supplies maybe, or equipment maintenance. He slowed his approach, moving from tree to tree, using techniques his grandfather had taught him for getting close to wary game. The camp was set up in a natural amphitheater formed by 3 converging ravines. Dan counted at least 4 people below. 3 figures that had to be the geological team, tied to trees around a central fire, and 1 other person moving between them with the confident efficiency of someone completely in control of the situation. Marcus Thornfield was smaller than Dan had expected, maybe 5'10", lean, but not thin. Military bearing was evident in how he moved, economy of motion, constant environmental awareness, weapons and equipment positioned for instant access. He wore civilian hiking gear, but it was organized and maintained with military precision. Dan positioned himself on the ridge above the camp and keyed his radio. "I can see them." "Of course you can. You chose the correct location based on tactical advantages rather than emotional urgency. Impressive decision-making under pressure. Let them go. Walk down into the camp, Mr. Hayes. Let's finish this conversation face to face." Dan studied the camp layout. 3 clear approaches, but all of them would leave him exposed for at least 30 yards. Multiple weapons visible on Thornfield's person. The prisoners were positioned so that any aggressive action would put them in immediate danger, but the tactical situation wasn't what made Dan hesitate. It was the realization that everything, the missing persons report, the carefully orchestrated trail of evidence, the psychological manipulation, had been designed to bring him to this exact moment. Thornfield hadn't been hunting the geological team. He'd been hunting Dan. "You arranged for them to be here," Dan said into his radio. "The survey was real, but I may have influenced their route selection. Amazing what people will do when they receive official-looking documents suggesting priority research areas." Dan began working his way down toward the camp, moving from cover to cover but not trying to hide his approach entirely. If Thornfield wanted a face-to-face confrontation, attempting stealth would probably endanger the prisoners. "Why me specifically?" "Because your reputation suggested you might be different. Most people, even trained professionals, break down when the systems they depend on fail. But you've been adapting, thinking, hunting back. You haven't once called for backup or tried to retreat to safety. You've treated this as a tactical problem to be solved." Dan reached the edge of the camp clearing. Thornfield stood beside the fire with military precision, weapons holstered but accessible, body language calm and non-threatening despite the circumstances. Up close, Dan could see the intelligence in the man's eyes, but also something else. A kind of focused intensity that suggested someone who had pushed himself beyond normal psychological limits and found something on the other side. "The question," Thornfield continued, is what you do now that you understand the real situation, which is that this isn't about rescuing three strangers, it's about discovering whether you're truly evolved or just another civilized pretender. Dan looked at the three prisoners, 2 men and 1 woman, all conscious, all watching him with desperate hope. The geological equipment he'd seen at their camp was arranged nearby: core samples, survey instruments, mapping software. Real scientists doing real work, now caught in someone else's philosophical experiment. "What's the test?" Thornfield smiled, and for the first time his voice carried genuine warmth. "Finally, an honest question. The test is simple. You have 2 choices. You can attempt to rescue these 3 people, knowing that I have superior position, better weapons, and detailed knowledge of this terrain. The odds of success are perhaps 20%, and failure means 4 deaths instead of 3. Or you acknowledge that this situation is beyond conventional rescue protocols and join me in a different kind of hunt. We leave the civilians unharmed. I have no interest in prey that can't fight back, and see which of us is the better predator." Dan felt something cold settle in his stomach. The test wasn't about rescue skills or tactical thinking. It was about fundamental moral choice. Thornfield was offering him a chance to step outside civilized constraints, to embrace the same philosophy that had transformed a decorated soldier into something else entirely. "You're insane. I'm liberated. There's a difference. Insanity is continuing to believe in systems that have failed, continuing to follow rules that protect the weak and constrain the strong. I've simply accepted what evolution has been trying to teach us for millions of years." Dan looked again at the prisoners, then at Thornfield. The man was watching him with genuine curiosity, as if this moment would reveal something profound about human nature. And maybe it would. Dan's hand moved toward his radio, but instead of calling for backup he'd known wouldn't come, he triggered the emergency beacon on his GPS unit. It would take hours for any response, but it would also leave an electronic record of his location and circumstances. Then he looked directly at Thornfield and said, "There's a third option you didn't consider, which is that maybe you're right about predators and prey, but wrong about which category I belong to." Dan moved. His grandfather had taught him that successful hunting required patience, observation, and the ability to act decisively when the moment was right. Dan had been observing for hours, and now he understood exactly what kind of predator he was facing. Thornfield was tactically superior, better armed, and held the high ground. But he had one critical weakness: intellectual arrogance. He was so confident in his philosophical framework that he'd overlooked the possibility that Dan might reject both offered choices and create a third option. Dan's attack wasn't designed to overpower Thornfield directly. Instead, he used his superior knowledge of the terrain, his spatial memory ability providing detailed recall of every rock, tree, and sightline in the area. He rolled behind the fallen log where he'd positioned himself during reconnaissance, came up with a throwing rock, and put it directly into the fire. The explosion of sparks and smoke created exactly the distraction he needed. While Thornfield was dealing with sudden visual impairment and the instinctive flinch away from flying embers, Dan was already moving to his second position. The fight that followed lasted less than 3 minutes, but felt like hours. Thornfield was good. Very good. His military training showed in every movement, every tactical decision. But Dan had advantages the other man hadn't anticipated. He knew this terrain intimately. His natural orientation ability let him move confidently even when smoke and shadows limited visibility. And most importantly, he was fighting for something beyond personal survival or philosophical proving grounds. When it ended, Thornfield lay unconscious beside the scattered remains of his carefully organized camp, secured with his own equipment. The 3 geological team members were shaken but unharmed. Dan's radio finally raised base camp, and within 2 hours the area was swarming with Park Service personnel, federal agents, and medical teams. Later, during the inevitable debriefing, investigators would piece together Marcus Thornfield's story. Decorated war veteran turned vigilante philosopher, responsible for at least 7 similar tests across multiple states. The psychological profile suggested someone who had experienced severe trauma and constructed an elaborate justification for predatory behavior. But Dan knew the real story was more complicated than the official reports would ever capture. Thornfield hadn't been entirely wrong about human nature or the artificial constraints of civilization. In those final moments of their confrontation, Dan had felt something awaken in himself, a capacity for decisive action that went beyond normal moral boundaries. The difference was that Dan had channeled that capacity toward protection rather than predation. He'd become dangerous not to prove a philosophical point, but to safeguard people who couldn't protect themselves. As he packed his gear in the parking lot that evening, Dan realized that Thornfield's test had succeeded in ways the man probably never intended. It had forced Dan to confront what kind of person he was when everything familiar was stripped away. The answer satisfied him in ways he was still trying to understand. 6 months later, Dan returned to work with the Park Service, not because the bureaucracy had improved or the systems had become more reliable, but because he'd learned something important about the relationship between civilization and wilderness. Both were necessary. Civilization provided the moral framework that separated protection from predation. But wilderness revealed the strength needed to make that framework meaningful when it really mattered. Some tests, Dan had learned, were worth taking, not because they proved anything about evolution or human nature, but because they clarified who you chose to be when choosing mattered most. The forest had taught him that lesson, just like his grandfather always said it would. He'd just needed the right teacher to help him understand it. Sam Carter's phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m., dragging him from the kind of deep sleep that only came after 3 years of sleeping indoors. The caller ID showed Park Service dispatch. They still called him for the difficult cases, even though his resignation letter was 2 years old and gathering dust in some administrator's filing cabinet. Carter here. Sam, it's Jennifer. I know you're out, but we've got a situation. The Hendricks family, mom, dad, 2 kids, went missing 3 days ago on the Highline Trail. Search and rescue's been out there since yesterday morning with nothing. Local sheriff's talking about calling in the feds. Sam sat up, already calculating. Late October in Glacier meant 14 hours of daylight if you were lucky, temperatures dropping to the 20s at night, and the first serious snow could come any time. What's their experience level? Minimal. Dad's an accountant from Denver, thought a family hiking trip would be good bonding time. They were supposed to be back Sunday night. Equipment? Basic day packs. No overnight gear, no GPS, just a paper map, and probably dead cell phones by now. Sam was already pulling on his boots. I'll be at the Logan Pass trailhead in 2 hours. Sam, there's something else. The team that went out yesterday, they found some of their gear scattered around mile marker 7, but it was arranged, like someone had laid it out deliberately. The first cold finger of unease traced Sam's spine. In 5 years as a ranger, he'd pulled dozens of people out of situations that should have killed them, and he'd found plenty who hadn't been so lucky. But scattered gear arranged deliberately, that was different. I'm on my way. The drive from his cabin to the park took 90 minutes in good weather. At this hour, with frost making the mountain roads treacherous, it took 2 hours and 15 minutes. Sam used the time to think about what he knew, which wasn't much, and what he suspected, which was getting worse by the mile. The Hendricks family, Robert, 42, insurance adjuster, Patricia, 39, elementary school teacher. Kids were Emma, 14, and David, 11. They'd checked into the Apgar Village Lodge on Thursday, spent Friday getting oriented and buying additional gear they probably didn't know how to use, then headed out Saturday morning for what the desk clerk described as an easy day hike to see the leaves. By the time Sam reached the Logan Pass Visitor Center, the sun was just beginning to paint the mountain peaks gold and orange. The parking lot was nearly empty, just his truck, a Park Service vehicle, and a Sheriff's Department cruiser. Sam grabbed his pack from the truck bed and performed his morning ritual. First, he checked his equipment with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through hundreds of search and rescue operations. Water, 3 liters, plus purification tablets. Food, energy bars, trail mix, emergency rations for 2 days. Shelter, ultralight bivy sack, emergency blanket. Navigation, GPS unit, compass, waterproof maps of the entire glacier backcountry. Communication, satellite communicator, spare batteries. Medical, comprehensive first aid kit weighted toward treating hypothermia and trauma. Tools, multi-tool, rope, headlamp, knife. But equipment was only part of preparation. Sam stood in the empty parking lot and let his senses adjust to the environment. The air was clean and sharp with the smell of snow from the high peaks. The wind was coming from the northwest, carrying the scent of pine and something else. Something that didn't belong. Wood smoke. There shouldn't be any wood smoke up here. Campfires were prohibited above the tree line, and it was too early in the season for the Park Service to be doing any controlled burns. Sam filed the observation away and headed toward the trailhead. The Highline Trail was one of Glacier's most popular day hikes when the weather was good. A relatively easy 11-mile trek along the Continental Divide with spectacular views of the peaks and valleys. But late October was different. Most of the trail was still passable, but sections could be icy and weather could change from pleasant hiking conditions to life-threatening in less than an hour. Sam had walked maybe 30 yards from the parking lot when he found the first anomaly. In the soft dirt beside the trail, pressed deep enough to indicate someone carrying a heavy pack, was a boot print, size 11, probably men's, with a distinctive wear pattern on the right edge of the heel that suggested the wearer favored his left side. The print was fresh, made within the last 12 hours, definitely after yesterday's search team had come through. But that wasn't what made Sam stop and stare. The print was facing the wrong direction. Instead of pointing up the trail toward the high country where the Hendricks family had supposedly gone, it pointed back toward the parking lot. Someone had been walking away from the search area, not toward it, and they'd been walking in the early morning darkness. Sam knelt beside the print and used his tracking abilities to read what it told him. The depth was consistent, which meant the person wasn't injured or struggling. The edges were clean, which meant they'd been moving at a steady, controlled pace. But most telling was the spacing. The next print was exactly 32 inches away, and the next after that was the same distance, military cadence. Someone with training had been walking down this trail in the pre-dawn darkness with the measured pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Sam photographed the print with his phone and continued up the trail. Within a quarter mile, he found 2 more prints from the same boots, both facing the wrong direction. Then, as he approached the first switchback, the prints vanished entirely, not because the terrain got hard, but because whoever was making them had deliberately moved onto rocky ground where they wouldn't leave tracks. Professional behavior. Someone who understood how to move without leaving sign. The trail wound upward through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, the autumn leaves creating a golden canopy that filtered the morning sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. Under normal circumstances, it was beautiful. Today, something was wrong with the entire ecosystem. Sam had been walking for 45 minutes when he realized what was bothering him. The forest was too quiet. It wasn't just the absence of human sounds. He was used to that. It was the absence of natural sounds. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed muted. In 5 years of working these mountains, Sam had never experienced a silence this complete. He stopped walking and used his nature-reading abilities to analyze what he was observing. In a healthy forest ecosystem, animals provided a constant background soundtrack. Birds called to establish territory and communicate with their flocks. Small mammals rustled through underbrush searching for food. Insects created their own complex symphony. Silence like this meant one of 3 things. A major predator was nearby. There had been a significant environmental disturbance, or something had frightened every living creature in a wide radius. Sam scanned the tree line for movement and listened for any sound that might indicate what had caused the disruption. After 5 minutes of complete stillness, he heard it. A single crow calling from somewhere ahead on the trail. Not the territorial call of a bird establishing its presence, but the harsh warning cry that crows use to alert other animals to danger. The crow called 3 more times, then went silent. Sam continued up the trail, now moving with the careful attention of someone who understood he might not be alone in these mountains. Every 50 yards, he stopped to scan his surroundings and listen. The silence remained absolute. At mile marker 3, he found the first piece of Hendrik's family gear. It was Emma's pink water bottle, placed carefully on a flat rock beside the trail. Not dropped, not discarded, but placed with deliberate precision in a spot where it couldn't be missed. The bottle was empty, and when Sam examined it closely, he could see that it had been wiped clean. No fingerprints, no mud, no normal wear patterns from 3 days of hiking. Someone had cleaned this bottle and positioned it as a signal. Sam photographed the water bottle from multiple angles, then picked it up with a bandana to avoid contaminating any evidence that might remain. As he lifted it, something rattled inside. He unscrewed the cap and shook out a small piece of paper, folded twice. Written in block letters with a pencil were 4 words. "They're safe for now." The handwriting was neat, controlled, definitely adult. Someone had taken Emma's water bottle, cleaned it, written a note, and placed it where the search team would find it. But the message raised more questions than it answered. Safe from what? Safe where? And who was making these assurances? Sam folded the note back into the bottle and continued up the trail. The silence was beginning to feel oppressive, and he found himself checking over his shoulder every few minutes. His human presence detection abilities were starting to activate. That subtle awareness that came from years of tracking both animals and people through wilderness terrain. Someone was watching him. The sensation was unmistakable once you learned to recognize it. A slight prickling at the base of the neck, a sense of weight pressing on your peripheral vision, the feeling that the natural patterns of the forest had been disrupted by an observer. Sam had first experienced it as a rookie ranger tracking a poacher through Yellowstone backcountry, and it had probably saved his life when the poacher turned out to be armed and unstable. Now, 3 years later and 2,000 miles away, he felt it again. Sam continued walking, but began using techniques he'd learned for determining the location of hidden observers. Instead of looking around, obviously, he used reflective surfaces, his phone screen, the metal housing of his GPS unit, even the curved surface of his water bottle, to scan areas behind and to the sides of the trail without turning his head. At mile marker 4, he spotted movement. 200 yards upslope and slightly behind his position, a figure in camouflage clothing was moving parallel to the trail, staying just inside the tree line where the shadows were deepest. The person was keeping pace with Sam's movement, stopping when Sam stopped, advancing when Sam advanced. Professional stalking behavior. Sam pretended to check his map while using his phone's camera to zoom in on the area where he'd seen the movement. The figure was gone, but the branches where he'd been standing were still moving slightly in a way that indicated recent passage. Someone with advanced fieldcraft skills was following him, and they were good enough to break contact when they realized they'd been spotted. Sam folded his map and continued up the trail, now certain that the Hendricks family's disappearance was not a simple case of inexperienced hikers getting lost in unfamiliar terrain. This was something else entirely, and he was walking directly into whatever trap had been set for him. At mile marker 5, Sam found Robert Hendricks' hiking boots. They were placed side by side on a flat section of trail, laces tied, positioned with the same deliberate precision as Emma's water bottle. The boots were clean. No mud, no scuff marks, no normal signs of wear from 3 days of hiking rough terrain. Sam examined the boots without touching them. Size 10.5, expensive hiking models, probably purchased specifically for this trip. But the lack of wear patterns told him these boots hadn't been used for serious hiking. The Hendricks family hadn't made it this far on their own. Someone had brought these boots here and arranged them as another signal. As Sam was photographing the boots, his satellite communicator chimed with an incoming message. The device had been quiet all morning, which meant he was far enough into the backcountry that cell service was non-existent, but satellite coverage was still available. The message was from an unknown number. Enjoying the hike. Sam stared at the small screen. Someone was monitoring his satellite communications, which should have been impossible. The communicator used military-grade encryption and a private satellite network that required specialized equipment to intercept. He typed a response. "Who is this?" The reply came immediately. "Someone who appreciates professional skill. You're better than the others. Where is the family? Safe. For now. Continue to mile marker 7, alone." Sam considered his options. He could turn around, hike back to the parking lot, and wait for a full search and rescue team with FBI support. But the Hendricks family might not have time for bureaucratic protocols, and whoever was sending these messages had already demonstrated capabilities that suggested normal law enforcement approaches might not be effective. Or he could continue up the trail and walk into whatever confrontation was waiting for him at mile marker 7. Sam had always trusted his instincts, and right now they were telling him that the person who had taken the Hendricks family was evaluating him, testing his skills and reactions. The messages weren't threats. They were invitations to continue a game that had probably been planned long before Sam had received the phone call that morning. He typed back, "On my way." The response came immediately. "I thought so." Mile marker 6 brought another piece of evidence. Patricia Hendricks' fleece jacket, folded neatly and placed on a fallen log beside the trail. Like everything else, it was clean and positioned with deliberate precision. But when Sam examined it closely, he found something different. 3 pine needles had been placed on top of the jacket, arranged in a triangle pattern. Not placed randomly, but positioned with geometric precision that indicated deliberate intent. Someone was leaving increasingly complex signals, and the signals were becoming more personal. Sam used his investigative intuition to analyze what he was seeing. The water bottle had contained a message. The boots had been positioned to indicate the family's presence. Now the jacket was marked with a pattern that suggested what? The pine needles were from a specific species of white pine that didn't grow at this elevation. Someone had carried them up from lower altitude and placed them specifically for Sam to find. The triangular arrangement suggested military or tactical training, the kind of geometric thinking that came from map reading, land navigation, and mission planning. Sam was dealing with someone who had military experience. The realization changed his entire approach to the situation. If the person who had taken the Hendricks family was former military, they would understand terrain, weather, equipment, and human psychology in ways that made them extremely dangerous. But they would also have predictable training patterns and behavioral tendencies that could be exploited. Sam continued up the trail, now actively using his natural orientation abilities to track his position and plan escape routes. The terrain was becoming more exposed as he approached the high country, with fewer places to hide and longer sight lines that favored an observer with optical equipment. At mile marker 7, Sam found David Hendricks. The 11-year-old boy was sitting on a rock beside the trail, wrapped in an adult-sized military surplus blanket and holding a cup of hot chocolate. He was uninjured, alert, and apparently well cared for, but his eyes held the careful wariness of someone who had been through an experience that was beyond his understanding. "David?" Sam approached slowly, hands visible. "I'm Sam Carter. I'm here to help." The boy nodded but didn't move. "He said you'd come. He said you were the best tracker in Montana." "Who said that, David?" "The soldier man. He's been taking care of us, but he said we have to wait here until you arrived." David's voice was steady, but Sam could see the tension in his shoulders. "He said you'd understand the game." "What game?" David pointed up the trail toward the high country. "He's up there with Mom and Dad and Emma. He said if you're as good as he thinks you are, you'll find them before dark. But if you're not..." David's voice trailed off. "If I'm not what?" "If you're not, then we'll all stay here forever." Sam knelt down to David's eye level. "Are you hurt? Has anyone hurt you?" "No, sir. He's been real nice. Gave us good food and warm places to sleep. But he watches us all the time and he asks a lot of questions." "What kind of questions?" "About survival stuff, like how long could we go without water? How would we stay warm if we didn't have sleeping bags? What would we eat if we ran out of food?" David shifted uncomfortably. "He made us practice things." "What kinds of things?" "Fire starting without matches, finding water, making shelter. He said he was testing how good people are at staying alive." Sam felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to connect. Someone with military survival training had taken a family of inexperienced hikers and was using them as subjects in some kind of twisted survival experiment. But why target this particular family, and why bring Sam into the situation? "David, I'm going to get you out of here, but I need to know everything the soldier man told you about me." The boy considered for a moment. "He said you used to be a ranger, but you quit because you got tired of saving people who made stupid mistakes. He said you were the best at finding lost people because you think like them instead of thinking like a rescuer." Sam's blood went cold. Those weren't details that would be in any public record. Someone had researched him extensively, knew about his resignation from the Park Service, and understood his motivations in ways that suggested access to confidential information. "He said you have special skills that regular people don't have," David continued. "Like, you can see tracks that are invisible and you know when animals are acting weird because something's wrong." "What else?" "He said if you found me, it meant you passed the first test. The second test is finding the rest of us before the weather gets bad." David looked up at the sky, where clouds were beginning to build over the high peaks. "He said there's snow coming tonight." Sam checked his weather app. The forecast showed a 60% chance of snow above 8,000 feet, with temperatures dropping into the teens. They were currently at about 7,500 feet, and the high country where the rest of the family was presumably being held was above 9,000 feet. If David was right about snow coming, the situation had just become much more serious. "David, I want you to stay right here. Don't move from this spot, no matter what you hear or see. I'm going to come back for you. But first I have to find your family." "He said you'd say that." "What did he say I'd do next?" David pulled a folded piece of paper from under his blanket. "He said to give you this when you ask that question." Sam unfolded the paper and found a hand-drawn map showing the trail system above mile marker 7. A route was marked in red ink, leading to a location marked with an X about 3 miles into the backcountry. At the bottom of the map was a message. "Impressive tracking. Now let's see if you can navigate what I've prepared for you and VC." The initials were followed by a time, 1800 hours. Sam checked his watch. It was 2:30 p.m., which gave him 3.5 hours to cover 3 miles of high-altitude terrain and deal with whatever was waiting at the marked location. Doable under normal conditions, but these weren't normal conditions. David, what does the soldier man look like? Tall, maybe 50 years old. He walks funny, like his leg hurts. He has scars on his face and hands, and he talks like he's still in the army, you know. Real formal and polite, but kind of scary. Sam studied the hand-drawn map. The route led through some of the most challenging terrain in Glacier National Park. Rocky slopes, exposed ridges, and areas where a single wrong step could result in a fatal fall. But the person who had drawn this map knew the country intimately and had chosen a path that would test every aspect of Sam's wilderness skills. David, I'm going to leave you my satellite communicator. If I'm not back by dark, or if anyone else shows up, you push this button and talk to the voice that answers. Tell them exactly where you are and what's happened. Sam showed David how to operate the device, then shouldered his pack and started up the trail toward the high country. Behind him, an 11-year-old boy wrapped in a military blanket watched him disappear into the forest, and 3 miles ahead, someone who had studied Sam's abilities was waiting to see if all that research had been accurate. The trail above mile marker 7 was barely a trail at all, more of a game path that wound through increasingly rocky and exposed terrain. Sam used his natural orientation abilities to follow the route marked on the hand-drawn map. But whoever had created the path had chosen every section to maximize difficulty. Sam climbed steadily for an hour, gaining elevation quickly as the trail wound upward through stands of whitebark pine and alpine fir. The trees were becoming smaller and more twisted as he approached treeline, and the vegetation was taking on the sparse, hardy characteristics of high-altitude plant communities. At 3:45 p.m., Sam found the first deliberate obstruction. A section of the trail had been blocked by fallen trees, not blown down by wind, but deliberately cut and positioned to force anyone following the path to find an alternative route. The trees were arranged in a pattern that funneled travelers toward a narrow gap between 2 large boulders. Sam approached the gap carefully, his human presence detection abilities telling him that this was a likely ambush point. But when he examined the ground around the gap, he found something unexpected. Boot prints from multiple people, including small prints that could have belonged to Emma and David. The family had been through here, but they'd been traveling with someone who was helping them navigate the obstacles. Sam could see evidence that ropes had been used to help the inexperienced hikers through the most difficult sections. This wasn't a kidnapping in any traditional sense. It was an elaborate relocation, and whoever was orchestrating it was taking care to ensure that his subjects survived the experience in good health. Sam worked his way through the gap between the boulders and found himself on a narrow ledge that led across an exposed cliff face. The path was maybe 18 inches wide, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet on the left side and vertical rock wall on the right. Under normal circumstances, moving inexperienced hikers across terrain like this would be extremely dangerous. But someone had installed a fixed rope along the wall, creating a basic via ferrata that would allow civilians to safely traverse the exposure. Whoever had brought the Hendricks family up here had both the equipment and the expertise to move them safely through terrain that would normally be accessible only to experienced mountaineers. Sam clipped into the fixed rope and began working his way across the cliff face. The exposure was intense. One slip would mean certain death. But the rope system was professionally installed with high-quality anchors and hardware, military-grade equipment, and professional technique. Halfway across the traverse, Sam found another message. It was carved directly into the rock face. Most people would turn back now. Below the message was an arrow pointing upward toward an even more exposed section of cliff that disappeared around a corner above. Sam looked down at the valley floor hundreds of feet below, then up at the route that continued around the cliff face into terrain he couldn't see. The rational decision would be to turn back, call for a specialized high-angle rescue team and approach the situation with proper equipment and backup. But Sam's investigative intuition was telling him that this entire scenario had been designed specifically to test whether he would make the rational decision or trust his abilities enough to continue alone. Someone was evaluating his commitment, his skill level, and his willingness to take calculated risks to save people he'd never met. Sam continued up the cliff face. The route around the corner led to a small ledge where someone had established what looked like a temporary observation post. There was a lightweight camping chair positioned to overlook the valley below, a high-powered spotting scope on a tripod, and a military-style radio setup with a satellite antenna. On the chair was another note. "Excellent decision-making. You're better than I expected." The note was signed with the same initials, VC. Sam examined the observation post more carefully. The equipment was expensive and specialized, the kind of gear used by military forward observers or long-range surveillance teams. The spotting scope was powerful enough to watch movement on trails throughout the entire valley system, and the radio setup could monitor park service communications as well as maintain satellite contact with outside contacts. Whoever VC was, he had been planning this operation for a long time and had resources that suggested either current or former military connections. Sam used the spotting scope to scan the terrain ahead and located the X marked on the hand-drawn map. It was another half-mile up the ridge, at a location that appeared to be a natural amphitheater surrounded by steep rock walls. Even through the powerful optics, he could see what looked like a camp setup with several shelters. As Sam was studying the target location, his satellite communicator chimed with another message. "Enjoying the view?" Sam typed back, "Impressive setup. Military? Former. You? Forest Service? Different kind of training. Indeed. Continue to the objective. We have things to discuss." Sam left the observation post and continued up the ridge. The terrain was becoming increasingly difficult. Loose rock, exposed sections, and elevation that was beginning to affect his breathing. But the route was clearly marked with small cairns and occasional pieces of colored flagging tape. At 5:15 p.m., with about 45 minutes of daylight remaining, Sam reached the location marked on the map. The amphitheater was larger than it had appeared through the spotting scope, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by rock walls that rose 30 or 40 feet on all sides. Someone had established a professional quality camp in the center of the space, with military-style tents, a cooking area, and what appeared to be a complete communications setup. Patricia, Robert, and Emma Hendricks were sitting around a small campfire, drinking hot beverages and wearing military surplus clothing that was clearly too large for them. They appeared unharmed and relatively comfortable, but Sam could see the tension in their postures. Standing beside the fire was a man in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing military-style clothing and carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. He was tall, lean, and moved with a slight limp that favored his left leg. His face and hands showed multiple scars that suggested combat experience. "Mr. Carter," the man said as Sam approached. "Vincent Cray, formerly Major Vincent Cray, U.S. Army Special Forces. Welcome to my field exercise." Sam kept his hands visible and approached slowly. "Mr. Cray, I assume you're the one who's been sending messages." "I am. And I must say, your performance today has been exemplary. Most civilian search and rescue personnel would have turned back at the cliff traverse. Most civilian search and rescue personnel would have brought a full team and proper equipment." Cray smiled. "Exactly. Which is why you're here alone, and why this family is still alive." Sam looked at the Hendricks family. Patricia was holding Emma close, and Robert was watching the conversation with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a situation that was beyond his experience. "Are you hurt?" Sam asked them. "We're fine," Robert answered. "Confused, but fine. Major Cray has been taking care of us. It's just Mr. Cray now, Cray corrected. I was medically retired after an improvised explosive device took out most of my left leg and ended my military career. Sam studied Cray's stance and movement patterns. The man was clearly favoring his left side, but he moved with the controlled precision of someone who had adapted to his limitations and compensated for them through training and discipline. "Why this family?" Sam asked. "Wrong place, wrong time," Cray replied. "I've been conducting research into civilian survival capabilities, and the Hendricks family presented an ideal test case. Minimal experience, standard equipment, predictable behavioral patterns." "Research?" Cray gestured toward the communications equipment. "I've been documenting how untrained civilians respond to controlled survival scenarios. The data is quite interesting." Sam felt his human presence detection abilities activate again. Something about this conversation was wrong. Cray was being too forthcoming, too willing to explain his actions. In Sam's experience, people who kidnapped families didn't usually give detailed explanations of their motivations to the first person who tracked them down. "You could have conducted your research without involving innocent people," Sam said. "Could I?" Cray's expression became more serious. "Mr. Carter, do you know how many people die in national parks every year because they overestimate their abilities and underestimate the environment?" "Some. 160 on average. Most of them could be saved if they had proper training and realistic expectations of their limitations." Cray limped closer to the fire. "I've developed a program that could reduce those fatalities by 80%. By kidnapping families, by providing realistic survival training that forces people to understand their actual capabilities rather than their imagined ones." Cray's voice was becoming more passionate. "These people spent 3 days learning skills that could save their lives someday. They now know how to find water, start fire without matches, build effective shelter, and navigate without GPS." Sam looked at the family again. Despite their obvious tension, they did appear to be unharmed and relatively well-equipped for the conditions. "Mr. Carter," Patricia Hendricks spoke up, "he never hurt us. He scared us, but he taught us things. Things we should have known before we came up here. The children learned faster than the adults," Cray added. "Emma can now build a fire in wet conditions, and David understands basic navigation principles. Skills that could save their lives." Sam was beginning to understand Cray's motivation, but understanding didn't make the methods acceptable. "You can't force people to learn survival skills by putting them in life-threatening situations." "Can't I?" Cray pulled out a tablet computer and showed Sam a series of photographs. "These are pictures of the gear the Hendricks family brought on their hike. Cotton clothing, inadequate rain protection, no emergency shelter, minimal food, and no backup navigation tools." The photos showed exactly the kind of equipment choices that got people killed in the mountains. Gear selected based on price and appearance rather than functionality. They were planning to hike 11 miles in October weather with equipment that wouldn't keep them alive through a single night of exposure. Cray continued, "I probably saved their lives by intercepting them, by kidnapping them, by educating them." Cray's voice was becoming harder. "Mr. Carter, you spent 5 years pulling people out of situations they should never have gotten into. How many times did you risk your own life because someone made stupid decisions about equipment, weather, or route planning?" Sam didn't answer, but the question hit closer to home than he wanted to admit. "How many times did you want to shake people and make them understand that wilderness isn't a theme park where poor planning gets rewarded with helicopter rescues?" Cray pressed. "How many times did you wish you could force people to learn what they needed to know before they needed to know it?" "Every time," Sam admitted, "but that doesn't justify what you're doing." "Doesn't it?" Cray activated a handheld GPS unit and showed Sam the display. "We're currently 12 miles from the nearest road, at an elevation of 9,000 feet, with snow forecast to begin in less than 2 hours. The temperature will drop to 15 degrees tonight. Sam checked his own weather data and confirmed Cray's information. If I released this family right now, with their original equipment and knowledge level, what do you think their chances of survival would be? Sam ran the calculations. 12 miles of rough terrain in darkness, with inexperienced hikers, inadequate clothing, and no emergency shelter. In current conditions, their chances would be close to 0. But now, Cray continued, after 3 days of intensive training, they have the skills and knowledge to survive the night if necessary. I've given them capabilities they didn't have when I found them. You've also traumatized them. Have I? Cray looked at the family. Mrs. Hendricks, do you feel traumatized? Patricia considered the question carefully. I feel different, scared, but also more confident than when we started hiking Saturday morning. I know things now that I didn't know before. Emma, the 14-year-old, looked up from the fire she'd been tending. I can start a fire now, and I know how to find water and build a shelter. Mom and Dad never taught me stuff like that. Robert nodded agreement. It's been terrifying, but we've learned more about wilderness survival in 3 days than we learned in 40 years of living in the city. Sam was beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. Cray's methods were unquestionably illegal and unethical, but the results suggested that his program might actually be effective at teaching survival skills that could save lives. Mr. Carter, Cray said, you have exceptional wilderness skills. You tracked this family through terrain that should have been impossible to follow. You navigated route obstacles that would stop most experienced hikers. You demonstrated exactly the kind of capabilities that keep people alive in environments like this. Sam remained silent, unsure where the conversation was heading. I'm offering you a chance to be part of something important. A program that could prevent hundreds of deaths by teaching people realistic survival skills before they need them. By kidnapping them? By providing intensive, immersive training that creates real understanding of wilderness dangers and capabilities. Cray's expression was earnest. Traditional wilderness education is ineffective because it's theoretical. People attend weekend seminars and think they understand survival, but they've never experienced actual discomfort, actual fear, actual consequences for poor decisions. Sam looked around the amphitheater. Despite the circumstances, it was clear that Cray had created a sophisticated training environment. The camp was well organized, the equipment was professional grade, and the location provided natural boundaries that would prevent students from wandering into more dangerous terrain. How many families have you trained? Sam asked. The Hendricks family is number 12 over the past 18 months. And where are the other 11 families? Alive and equipped with survival skills they didn't have before their experience. Cray pulled out another tablet and showed Sam a series of follow-up reports. I maintain contact with all my former students. 3 of them have used the skills I taught them to survive emergency situations that would have killed them without proper training. The report showed detailed accounts of survival situations where people had used fire-starting techniques, shelter-building skills, and navigation methods to survive unexpected emergencies. This is impressive data, Sam admitted, but it doesn't change the fact that you're kidnapping people. I'm saving lives, Cray replied. The families I train go home with realistic understanding of their capabilities and limitations. They purchase appropriate equipment. They make better decisions about weather and route planning. They teach their children actual survival skills instead of theoretical knowledge. Sam could see the logic in Cray's argument, but the methods remained problematic. There have to be legal ways to provide this kind of training. Are there? Cray's voice became more intense. I tried for 2 years to develop a legitimate wilderness education program. I approached park services, outdoor education organizations, wilderness guide services. Everyone was interested until they learned about the level of realism involved. What do you mean? Effective survival training requires genuine discomfort, genuine fear, and genuine consequences for poor decisions. Legal liability issues make it impossible to provide that kind of experience through conventional educational programs. Sam understood the problem. Modern outdoor education was heavily constrained by safety regulations and liability concerns that prevented the kind of intensive training that would actually prepare people for real emergencies. So you decided to operate outside the system. I decided to operate effectively. Cray checked his watch. Mr. Carter, it's now 5:45 p.m. Snow will begin within the hour and we'll have perhaps 30 minutes of usable daylight after that. You have a decision to make. What decision? You can arrest me, attempt to escort this family down 12 miles of technical terrain in darkness and snow, and hope that everyone survives the experience. Or you can allow me to complete their training by spending tonight in controlled survival conditions, then escort them out tomorrow morning when visibility and weather are better. Sam considered the options. Attempting to move the family in current conditions would be extremely dangerous, even with his skills and experience. Waiting until morning would be safer, but it would mean spending the night in Cray's camp and tacitly approving his methods. There's a third option, Sam said, which is, I radio for helicopter evacuation. Cray shook his head. Weather conditions preclude helicopter operations above 8,000 feet until the storm system passes. Earliest possible evacuation would be tomorrow afternoon. Sam checked his satellite communicator and confirmed that no emergency services were available in current conditions. Mr. Carter, Robert Hendricks spoke up. If staying here tonight is safer for my family, then that's what we should do. We can sort out the legal issues tomorrow. Patricia nodded agreement. I just want everyone to get home safely. Sam realized that his primary responsibility was ensuring the family's welfare, not enforcing law. In current conditions, the safest option was to wait until morning before attempting to leave. All right, Sam said. We'll stay tonight, but tomorrow morning we're walking out together and this ends. Cray smiled. Excellent decision. And Mr. Carter, tonight you'll have a chance to observe my training methods firsthand. I think you might find them more effective than you expect. As if summoned by Cray's words, the first snowflakes began to fall. The next 6 hours provided Sam with an intensive demonstration of Cray's training philosophy in action. Instead of simply providing shelter and waiting for morning, Cray used the approaching storm as a teaching opportunity for the family. Emma and David were tasked with maintaining the fire throughout the night, using techniques they'd learned for managing fuel consumption and heat output. Patricia and Robert worked together to monitor weather conditions and adjust their clothing and shelter systems as temperatures dropped. Cray served as instructor and supervisor, providing guidance when needed, but allowing the family to solve problems independently whenever possible. Traditional wilderness education teaches people to avoid challenging conditions, Cray explained to Sam as they watched the family work. My approach teaches people to manage challenging conditions effectively. Sam had to admit that the family's performance was impressive. Despite the deteriorating weather, they maintained warmth, nutrition, and morale through techniques that would have been completely unknown to them a week earlier. The key is realistic consequences, Cray continued. If Emma doesn't maintain the fire properly, everyone gets cold. If Robert doesn't monitor the weather correctly, they don't adjust their systems in time to stay dry. Natural feedback creates faster learning than any classroom instruction. By midnight, 6 inches of snow had fallen, and the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees. But the family remained warm, fed, and reasonably comfortable in their improvised shelter systems. Mr. Carter, Cray said as they sat beside the fire, I want to show you something. Cray pulled out his tablet and opened a file containing dozens of news articles about wilderness fatalities in national parks. Every one of these deaths was preventable, he said. Poor equipment choices, inadequate weather planning, overestimation of abilities, underestimation of environmental hazards. The articles showed pattern after pattern of preventable tragedies, families caught unprepared by weather changes, hikers lost because they relied solely on GPS devices that failed, people who died of exposure within sight of rescue because they didn't know how to signal for help effectively. 18 months ago, I decided to do something about it, Craig continued. I developed a program that could prevent these deaths by providing realistic survival education to people who would never seek it out voluntarily. By force. By necessity. Craig's voice was firm. Mr. Carter, how many times during your ranger career did you wish you could force people to understand wilderness realities before they got into life-threatening situations? Sam didn't answer, but the question struck home. He'd lost count of the number of rescues that could have been prevented by better preparation and realistic decision-making. I'm giving people survival capabilities they would never develop through conventional education, Cray said. The families I train go home with skills that could save their lives and the lives of their children. Sam looked at the Hendricks family, now sleeping comfortably in shelters they'd built themselves, warmed by a fire they were maintaining through the night, using skills they'd learned under Cray's instruction. What happens when you get caught? Sam asked. I get arrested, prosecuted, and probably sent to prison, Cray replied. But the families I've trained will still have their survival skills. The knowledge I've given them will still save lives. Is it worth it? Cray was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Mr. Carter, I spent 22 years in the military, including 4 combat deployments. I've seen what happens when people aren't properly trained for the situations they encounter. He paused, then continued. My last deployment was to Afghanistan, where I was responsible for training Afghan National Army units in survival and evasion techniques. Good people, but they'd never been taught realistic skills for operating in their own country's wilderness areas. Sam waited for the rest of the story. One unit I trained was ambushed during a patrol in the mountains outside Kandahar. They were cut off from their base for 6 days in winter conditions. Every man survived because they knew how to find water, build effective shelters, navigate without equipment, and signal for rescue. Cray's expression became more intense. 6 months later, that same unit was involved in an operation that saved 37 American soldiers who were trapped behind enemy lines. They used the survival skills I taught them to reach the Americans and guide them to safety. Sam began to understand the deeper motivation behind Cray's program. When I came back to the States and started reading about wilderness fatalities in national parks, I realized that civilians needed the same kind of training I'd been providing to military personnel. But every attempt to develop a legitimate program was blocked by liability concerns and bureaucratic restrictions. So you developed an illegitimate program. I developed an effective program. Cray met Sam's eyes. Mr. Carter, if your ranger experience had included the authority to mandate survival training for anyone who wanted to hike in dangerous terrain, how many lives could you have saved? The question was hypothetical, but Sam knew the answer. Mandatory survival training for wilderness recreation could prevent the majority of search and rescue operations and virtually eliminate weather-related fatalities. The families I train don't become experts, Cray continued, but they develop realistic understanding of their capabilities and limitations. They learn to make better decisions about equipment, weather, and route planning. Most importantly, they gain confidence that comes from knowing they can survive unexpected situations. Sam looked around the camp. Despite the illegal circumstances that had brought them here, the Hendricks family was demonstrating survival capabilities they would never have developed through conventional recreation. At 3 a.m., Emma woke up to add fuel to the fire, checked the weather conditions, and adjusted the family's shelter systems to account for increased snowfall. She performed these tasks with the quiet competence of someone who understood the consequences of poor decisions. "She'll never be helpless in the wilderness again," Cray observed. "Neither will her parents or her brother. They have skills that could save their lives." Sam had to admit that Cray's methods, however questionable, were producing measurable results. "What do you want from me?" Sam asked. "Help," Cray replied. "You have exactly the skills and experience needed to make this program more effective and safer. Together, we could develop training scenarios that provide realistic survival education without the legal and ethical problems of my current approach." Sam considered the offer. Cray was right about the need for more effective wilderness education, and Sam's ranger experience had taught him that conventional safety programs were inadequate for preventing wilderness fatalities. "I can't be part of kidnapping families," Sam said. "Then help me develop alternatives that don't require kidnapping families." Cray's expression was earnest. "Work with me to create legal methods for providing intensive survival training." Sam thought about the hundreds of search and rescue operations he'd conducted, the preventable deaths he'd witnessed, and the families who'd been destroyed by wilderness accidents that could have been avoided through better preparation. What would legal alternatives look like? Cray smiled. Voluntary intensive programs for people who are serious about wilderness recreation. Multi-day immersion courses that provide realistic survival training without the legal liability issues that prevent conventional organizations from offering effective education. Would people volunteer for genuine hardship training? Some would, enough to make a difference. Cray pulled out another tablet and showed Sam a business plan for a legitimate wilderness survival education company. "I've been working on this for months. The market research shows significant demand for intensive survival training among serious outdoor enthusiasts." Sam reviewed the business plan. It was professionally developed with detailed financial projections, marketing strategies, and operational procedures for providing advanced wilderness education through legal methods. "This could work," Sam admitted. "It will work with the right partners." Cray met Sam's eyes. "I need someone with your skills and reputation to help develop and implement the program." Sam was beginning to see possibilities that could address the wilderness safety problems he'd observed during his ranger career while operating within legal and ethical boundaries. The snow stopped falling at 4:30 a.m., leaving 8 inches of accumulation but clearing skies that would allow safe travel in the morning. Sam and Cray spent the remaining hours before dawn discussing possibilities for legitimate wilderness education programs. At first light, Sam helped the family break camp using techniques they'd learned during their 3 days with Cray. They were able to pack efficiently, leave no trace of their presence, and prepare for the hike out with competence that would have been impossible a week earlier. The descent took 4 hours, with the family navigating technical terrain, managing their equipment, and maintaining warmth and energy through methods they'd learned during their involuntary training experience. When they reached the parking lot at Logan Pass, David ran to Sam's truck and retrieved the satellite communicator he'd been guarding for 18 hours. "I never had to use it," he said proudly. "I knew you'd come back." Sam looked at the Hendricks family, now equipped with survival skills and confidence they'd never had before, then at Vincent Cray, who had developed an effective but illegal method for preventing wilderness fatalities. "Mr. Cray," he said, "I can't arrest you today, but I can't ignore what you've been doing. I understand. But I'm willing to help you develop legal alternatives that could accomplish the same goals." Cray smiled. "That's all I wanted to hear." 6 months later, Sam Carter and Vincent Cray opened the Mountain Survival Institute, a legal wilderness education company that provided intensive survival training to voluntary participants. Their programs included multi-day immersion courses, realistic scenario training, and follow-up education that gave people the skills needed to survive wilderness emergencies. The Hendricks family were their first graduates, and their testimonials helped recruit dozens of other families who wanted real survival education rather than theoretical wilderness safety lectures. Sam never reported Cray's illegal activities, but he made sure that future training was conducted with full participant consent and proper legal protections. The Mountain Survival Institute became one of the most respected wilderness education programs in the country, and their graduates had a 0% fatality rate in subsequent wilderness recreation. Sam had learned that sometimes the most effective solutions required working outside conventional systems, but that effectiveness didn't have to come at the expense of ethics. Vincent Cray had taught him that people were capable of learning far more than they thought possible when the consequences were real and the instruction was intensive. Most importantly, Sam had rediscovered his purpose in helping people develop the capabilities they needed to survive in environments that demanded respect, preparation, and genuine understanding of natural systems. The wilderness was still dangerous, but people no longer had to face those dangers unprepared.